Picture yourself under a wide, starry sky, the kind that stretches forever over a land so vast it swallows your thoughts. It's the Old West, sometime in the 1800s, and the air smells of dust and sagebrush. A wagon creaks in the distance, its wheels groaning against the rocky trail. Somewhere nearby, a fire crackles, sending up sparks that vanish into the night. Around that fire, a family of pioneers huddles close, their faces lit by the flickering glow, their hands busy with the one thing that keeps them going: food. Not grand feasts or fancy dishes, but simple, hard-earned meals that mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving land. Tonight, we're going to drift back to those days, to the lives of men, women, and children who crossed the plains and mountains, chasing dreams of a new home. We'll talk about what they ate, how they cooked, and the quiet, endless work of surviving in a world where every bite was a victory. But as we settle in, there's a question hanging in the air, like the faint howl of a coyote in the distance. What happens when the food runs out, when the trail grows harder, and the next town is weeks away? Let's start our journey and find out, letting the story unfold slowly, like the soft rustle of wind through the prairie grass. The pioneers who set out for the West weren't thinking about adventure the way we might imagine it. They were farmers, shopkeepers, or folks tired of crowded cities back east, lured by promises of free land or a fresh start. They loaded their lives into wagons, canvas-covered, no bigger than a modern bedroom, and hitched up oxen or mules. A family might be a man like John Harper, with calloused hands from years of plowing fields, his wife Sarah, who knew how to stretch a sack of flour into weeks of meals, and their 3 kids, wide-eyed, but already learning to carry their weight. The trail was no place for dreaming big. It was a place for grinding work, for waking at dawn to check the oxen's hooves, to mend a torn canvas, or to coax a fire from damp wood. And always, there was the question of food. What could they carry? What could they find? How could they make it last when the days stretched long and the nights grew cold? Food wasn't just something to eat. It was a plan, a hope, a shield against the wilderness. Before leaving a place like Missouri or Illinois, families like the Harpers spent weeks preparing. Sarah would stand in her kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, packing barrels with what she thought they'd need for months on the trail. Flour was the backbone, sacks of it, heavy and coarse, ground from wheat or corn. It wasn't the fine white flour we know today, but a gritty kind that stuck to your fingers. She'd pack beans too, dried pinto or navy beans, rattling like pebbles in a sack. Bacon came next, slabs of it salted and smoked, wrapped tight to keep out the dust. A few families could afford sugar or molasses, sealed in tin canisters, but it was a luxury, something to spoon out sparingly for the kids when the days got too hard. Coffee was another treasure, its bitter smell a comfort when the mornings were gray and damp. Everything was measured, counted, and packed with care, because a single spilled sack could mean hunger a month down the road. The wagons were like moving pantries, but they weren't big. A family of 5 might have room for 200 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of beans, 30 pounds of bacon, and maybe a small bag of dried apples or peaches if they were lucky. Every inch of space mattered. Sarah would wedge jars of pickles or preserves between the sacks, tying them down so they wouldn't break when a wagon hit a rut. Tools, clothes, and a rifle took up the rest of the space, leaving no room for extras. The kids, maybe Ellie, who was 10, and her younger brothers, Sam and Ben, learned early to walk beside the wagon, not ride, to save space and spare the oxen. They'd trudge along, their boots kicking up dust, their eyes scanning the horizon for anything that might mean food. A berry bush, a stream with fish, or a rabbit darting through the grass. Cooking on the trail was a chore that never ended. At the end of a long day, when the wagon train stopped, maybe near a creek or just a flat patch of dirt, Sarah would get to work. She'd gather wood, or if there was none, buffalo chips, dried dung that burned slow and smoky. The kids helped, stacking the chips in a pile, their hands gritty by the time the fire was lit. Sarah's cook fire was small, just enough to heat a cast-iron skillet or a pot. She'd mix flour with water and a pinch of salt to make dough, shaping it into flat cakes called Johnny cakes or biscuits. These weren't fluffy or golden. They were hard, dense, meant to fill bellies, not please them. She'd fry bacon in the skillet, the fat sizzling and spitting, saving every drop of grease to flavor the next meal. Beans went into a pot, soaking all day while the wagon rolled, then simmering for hours until they were soft enough to eat. The smell of beans and bacon would drift through the camp, mixing with the smoke and the dust, a reminder that survival was in the small things. Eating was a quiet affair. The family sat on the ground, maybe on a blanket if Sarah had packed one. John would say a quick prayer, his voice low, then they'd pass around the tin plates. A biscuit, a scoop of beans, a strip of bacon. That was supper, night after night. The kids might grumble, wanting something sweet, but Sarah would hush them, saving the dried fruit for a special day. Water came from a barrel on the wagon or a nearby stream. Boiled if they had time, sipped carefully to make it last. Coffee was for the adults, brewed strong and black, sipped from tin cups that burned their hands if they weren't careful. The meal was slow, not because they savored it, but because they were tired, their bodies aching from the day's walk, their minds already on tomorrow's miles. But the trail wasn't just about what they carried. The land itself could offer food if you knew where to look. John, with his rifle slung over his shoulder, kept an eye out for game. A deer or antelope was a prize, enough meat to feed the family for days. But game wasn't always easy to find. The plains were wide and empty, and animals learned to stay clear of wagon trains. More often, it was smaller things, a rabbit caught in a snare, a bird shot down with a careful aim. Ellie learned to spot edible plants, like wild onions or lamb's quarters. Their green leave a rare treat in a diet of brown and gray. Sarah would boil them into a thin soup, stretching the meal a little further. Sometimes, they'd trade with other travelers, maybe a few biscuits for a handful of dried berries or a bit of salt pork for a jar of honey. Every bite was a calculation, a balance between today's hunger and tomorrow's need. The seasons shaped what they ate, too. In spring, when the wagon trains often started, the land was kinder. Streams ran clear, and grass grew thick, meaning the oxen stayed strong. There might be wild greens or early berries, small bursts of flavor that made the kids smile. But as summer came, the heat dried the streams, and the grass turned brittle. The flour in the barrels started to weevil, tiny bugs crawling through the sacks. Sarah would sift them out as best she could, but sometimes the family just ate the flour, bugs and all, because wasting food wasn't an option. By fall, if they were still on the trail, the air turned sharp, and frost could settle on the wagon's canvas. The bacon went rancid faster in the heat, and the beans took longer to cook when wood was scarce. Winter was the worst, though most tried to reach their destination before the snows came. Those who didn't face days when the only meal was a handful of cold biscuits or a sip of watery soup. Other people shaped the journey, too. The wagon train was a community, a string of families moving together for safety. At night, the wagons formed a circle, like a wall against the dark. Families shared what they had, sometimes out of kindness, sometimes out of need. If the Harpers had extra beans, they might trade with the Thompsons, a young couple with a baby, for a bit of their cornmeal. Or maybe the Wilsons, an older pair with no kids, had a knack for finding wild herbs and would share a pinch for a strip of bacon. There were arguments, too, over who used too much water or whose oxen strayed. But food was the glue that kept them together. A shared meal around a fire could calm tempers, even if it was just a pot of beans and a story about the land they hoped to find. Indigenous tribes were part of the story, too, though the pioneers didn't always understand them. Sometimes, a group of Lakota or Cheyenne would approach the wagon train, their horses moving easy over the plains. John might tense, his hand on his rifle, but often it was about trade. The tribes had food the pioneers didn't. Dried buffalo meat, pounded in a pemmican with berries, or roots like camas, dug from the earth. Sarah learned to barter, offering a tin cup or a bit of cloth for a handful of pemmican. It was strange to her at first, chewy and rich, but filled the kids' bellies better than biscuits. These moments weren't always peaceful. Mistrust ran deep on both sides, but they were part of survival, a quiet exchange of goods under a wide sky. The trail wasn't just about food, it was about fear. Every day brought the worry that supplies wouldn't last. A wagon could break an axle, spilling a barrel of flour into the mud. A storm could soak the bacon, turning it slimy before anyone noticed. Disease was a shadow, too. Cholera or dysentery, spread by bad water or spoiled food. Sarah kept a sharp eye on the kids, watching for pale faces or sluggish steps. If Sam complained his stomach hurt, she'd boil water twice, just to be safe. And always, there was the land itself. Rivers too deep to cross, mountains that loomed like walls, or stretches of desert where nothing grew. The pioneers learned to ration, to cut their portions smaller when the miles stretched longer than expected. A biscuit might be split 5 ways, each piece no bigger than a walnut. As the weeks turned to months, the Harpers' wagon grew lighter, not because they wanted it to, but because the food was running low. The flour sack, once heavy enough to make John grunt when he lifted it, was half empty. The bacon was down to a few strips, the beans a single pot's worth. Sarah started skipping her own meals, saying she wasn't hungry, though her eyes said different. The kids were quieter now, their steps slower, their questions about when they'd get there fewer. John walked ahead, scouting for a stream or a deer, anything to stretch what they had left. The trail was supposed to lead to Oregon, to a valley where the soil was rich and the winters mild. But the map was just lines on paper, and the land didn't care about promises. One night, as the fire burned low, the family sat closer than usual. The air was cold, the stars sharp above them. Sarah stirred a pot of thin soup, beans, a bit of bacon grease, some wild onions Ellie had found. The smell was faint, barely enough to promise a full belly. John looked at the wagon, its canvas patched and sagging, and counted the days to the next trading post. Too many, he thought, but he didn't say it. Ellie, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, asked what they'd eat tomorrow. Sarah smiled, a tired smile, and said they'd find something. But in the dark where the firelight didn't reach, the question lingered. What happens when there's nothing left to find? The trail stretched on, and the answer was out there, waiting as the night grew quieter and the stars kept watch. The fire had died to embers, glowing faintly in the dark, and the Harpers sat in its fading warmth, their tin plates scraped clean. Sarah tucked the last of the soup pot under a cloth, saving the scraps for tomorrow, though there wasn't much left. John leaned against the wagon wheel, his eyes on the horizon, where the plains stretched endless and black. The kids were quiet, Ellie clutching her shawl, Sam and Ben curled up on a blanket, their breath slow but not yet asleep. The night was still, save for the distant yip of a coyote, and the questions Sarah hadn't answered hung heavy. What would they eat tomorrow? The wagon train was weeks from the next trading post, and the barrels were lighter than they should be. But for now, sleep was the only thing they could afford, so Sarah hummed softly, a tune from her childhood, hoping it would ease the kids into dreams. Morning came slow, the sky turning gray before pink. John was up first, checking the oxen, their ribs starting to show under dusty hides. He gave them a handful of grain from a dwindling sack, knowing they'd need strength to pull through the rocky stretch ahead. Sarah knelt by the fire pit, coaxing sparks from flint and steel, her hands steady despite the ache in her shoulders. The kids stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and Ellie fetched water from the barrel, careful not to spill a drop. Breakfast was the same as supper. A biscuit each, hard as a stone, and a sip of coffee for the adults, stretched thin with extra water. The beans were gone until Sarah could soak more, and the bacon was down to a rind, too precious to cook yet. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, the dry biscuits crumbling in their mouths. It wasn't enough to fill them, but it was enough to move on. The wagon train started moving as the sun climbed, a line of creaking wagons and plodding feet. The Harpers' wagon was near the middle, its canvas flapping in the breeze. John walked ahead, guiding the oxen with a low whistle, while Sarah kept pace beside, her skirt catching on sagebrush. The kids trailed behind, Sam kicking pebbles, Ben staring at the ground for anything edible, a berry, a root, anything to break the monotony of biscuits. The trail was rough today, the ground pitted with ruts from earlier wagons. Every jolt shook the barrels, and Sarah checked them twice, tying the ropes tighter, afraid a sack might tear. The The flour was their lifeline, but weevils had gotten into one bag, and she'd spent an hour last night picking them out by firelight, her fingers sore from the work. Food was always on their minds, a quiet worry that never left. Sarah planned every meal in her head as they walked, counting the days, the miles, the mouthfuls. The flour would last another month if she stretched it, but the beans were running low, and the bacon wouldn't see them to Oregon. She thought about the dried apples, hidden in a tin at the bottom of the wagon, saved for a day when the kids' spirits needed lifting. Maybe tomorrow, she told herself, if they found water to boil them into a sauce. For now, she focused on the next stop, a creek the wagon master said was a day away. Water meant a chance to soak beans, maybe catch a fish, or find greens along the banks. It wasn't much, but it was hope, and hope was what kept her feet moving. The land didn't make it easy. The plains were wide and dry, the grass brittle underfoot. The sun beat down, making the kids squint, and John wiped sweat from his brow. Sarah tied a bonnet tighter around her face, shielding her eyes from the dust kicked up by the oxen. They passed a buffalo skull, bleached white and half-buried, a reminder of the herds that used to roam here. John said the buffalo were getting scarce, hunted out or driven off by the trains. Once a single buffalo could feed a family for weeks, its meat dried into strips, its fat rendered for cooking. Now, they were lucky to see a rabbit, and John's rifle stayed slung over his shoulder, unfired for days. The kids had stopped asking when they'd eat meat, but their eyes followed every bird that flew overhead. At midday, the wagon train stopped to rest the animals. Sarah knelt by a small fire, mixing flour and water into a dough, her hands moving in the same slow rhythm she'd learned from her mother. She shaped it into flat cakes, cooking them on a skillet greased with a dab of bacon fat. The smell was faint but comforting, and she handed one to each child, their fingers warm from the bread. John ate his standing, scanning the horizon, always watching for trouble, whether animals or people. The Thompsons, the young couple from the next wagon, joined them, their baby fussing in a sling. Mary Thompson offered a pinch of salt, a small gift, and Sarah gave her a biscuit in return. They talked quietly about the trail, about a river crossing ahead that might be deep, about the rumors of a trading post that might have flour to sell. It was a small moment, but it felt like home, like a piece of the life they'd left behind. The afternoon stretched long, the wagons rolling again, the dust settling in their throats. Ellie walked beside Sarah, pointing out a patch of green in the distance, maybe a sign of water. Sarah nodded, her heart lifting a little, but she didn't say much. Words were heavy when you were tired, and the trail took all her energy. Ben lagged behind, his boots scuffing the dirt, and Sarah called him closer, worried he'd wander too far. The wagon train was safe, but the land wasn't. Snakes, cliffs, or sudden storms could turn a quiet day into disaster. She thought about supper, already dreading the moment she'd open the flour sack and see how little was left. Maybe she'd boil the bacon rind tonight, let its flavor stretch the beans a little further. Maybe John would find a rabbit, though she didn't count on it. As the sun dipped low, the wagon train circled up for the night, the wagons forming a ring against the dark. John helped the men drive stakes for the oxen, while Sarah and Ellie gathered buffalo chips, their hands smudged with dust. The fire was small, the flames licking at a pot of soaking beans. Sarah stirred them, watching the water bubble, her mind on the days ahead. The creek was close, but what if it was dry? What if the trading post was farther than they thought? The kids were hungry, their faces thinner than when they'd started. John sat beside her, silent, his hands resting on his knees. The stars were out now, sharp and countless, and the air carried a chill. Sarah looked at the pot, the beans barely enough for tomorrow, and felt the weight of the trail settle deeper. What would they do when the food was gone? The beans simmered in the pot, a faint steam rising into the cool night air, but Sarah knew they wouldn't be ready until morning. She covered the pot with a tin lid, tying a cloth around it to keep out the dust, and sat back on her heels, her hands resting in her lap. The fire was low, just a glow now, and the camp was settling into the quiet rhythm of night. John was checking the wagon's wheels, his shadow moving slow against the canvas, looking for cracks that could mean trouble tomorrow. Ellie and Sam were already under a blanket, their heads close together, whispering about something. A bird they'd seen, maybe, or a story from back home. Ben, the youngest, sat near Sarah, poking a stick into the dirt, his eyes heavy but not ready to close. The stars overhead were bright, like scattered grains of salt, and the air carried the dry smell of sagebrush. Sarah's mind was on the creek they'd reach tomorrow, or so the wagon master had promised. A creek meant water, maybe fish, maybe a chance to wash the grit from their clothes. But it also meant a crossing, and crossings were never easy. What if the water was too deep, or worse, not there at all? She pushed the thought away, focusing on the beans, on the small tasks that kept her hands busy and her heart steady. Supper had been thin, just a biscuit and a sip of water for each of them. Sarah had thought about boiling the bacon rind to flavor the meal, but she'd held off, saving it for a day when the kids' faces looked too pale. The flour sack was lighter every time she opened it, and she'd started mixing in a bit of cornmeal from a trade with the Wilsons to make it last. The biscuits were tougher now, almost too hard to chew without soaking them in coffee or water, but nobody complained. John ate his in small bites, his jaw working slow, his eyes on the fire. The kids nibbled theirs, saving crumbs in their pockets, a habit they'd picked up when they realized meals weren't certain. Sarah didn't eat tonight, saying she'd had enough at midday, though her stomach twisted as she said it. She'd done this before, skipping her share so the kids could have a little more, and John knew better than to argue. He just looked at her, his eyes soft in the firelight, and nodded. The wagon train was a circle of shadows now, the other families tending their own fires, their voices low. Sarah could hear the Thompsons' baby fussing, a soft cry that Mary hushed with a lullaby. The Wilsons were nearby, their fire brighter, and Sarah saw old Mr. Wilson whittling a stick, his knife moving in slow, careful strokes. They'd been kind, the Wilsons sharing a handful of dried herbs last week that Sarah had crumbled into a soup. In return, she'd given them a small jar of pickles, one of the last from her mother's recipe. These small trades were the heartbeat of the train, a way to stretch what little they had. Sometimes it was more than goods. Yesterday, Mrs. Wilson had shown Sarah how to wrap biscuits in damp cloth before baking to keep them softer, a trick Sarah wished she'd known sooner. Tonight, she'd try it, if the creek gave them enough water to spare. The kids were asleep now, their breaths even, and Sarah spread a second blanket over them, tucking it around their shoulders. John came back from the wagon, his hands smudged with grease from the axle, and sat beside her. He didn't speak, just stared into the embers, his fingers tracing the edge of his tin cup. Sarah wanted to ask what he was thinking, but she knew. The creek was on his mind, too, and the miles beyond it. The wagon master had said there was a trading post a week past the creek, maybe less if the weather held. A trading post meant flour, beans, maybe even sugar, but it also meant bartering with what little they had left, a knife, a blanket, or the last of Sarah's preserves. John's rifle was too precious to trade, their only hope for game, though the plains had been empty of deer or antelope for days. Sarah thought about the pemmican they'd gotten from a Cheyenne trader 2 weeks back. Its rich, chewy taste of memory now. If they reached the post, maybe they could trade for more. The night grew colder, and Sarah added a stick to the fire, watching the flames flicker. She thought about tomorrow's meal, planning it in her head like a prayer. The beans would be ready by morning, enough for a small bowl each. She'd bake biscuits, using Mrs. Wilson's trick, and maybe add a pinch of the herbs for flavor. If the creek had fish, John might try his luck with a line, though he wasn't much of a fisherman. Ellie was better at spotting plants, and Sarah hoped she'd find something green, wild onions or sorrel, to boil into a broth. Every meal was a puzzle, a way to stretch what they had just far enough. She remembered her mother's kitchen back in Illinois, the smell of fresh bread, the jars of jam lined up on a shelf. Here, on the trail, there was no room for such things, only the steady work of survival. John stood, stretching his back, and walked to the edge of the camp, his boots quiet on the dirt. He was checking the oxen again, or maybe just needing a moment alone. Sarah watched him go, her hands folding the cloth she'd used to cover the pot. The other families were settling in, their fires dying down, the camp growing still. She heard a soft laugh from the Thompsons' wagon, maybe Mary telling her husband a story to keep the baby calm. It was a small sound, but it warmed Sarah, a reminder that they weren't alone. The wagon train was a fragile thing, held together by shared fires and shared fears, but it was enough to keep going. She thought about the creek again, picturing its banks, hoping for clear water and soft grass. But the trail had taught her not to hope too hard. A creek could be a trickle, or a flood, or nothing at all. The fire was nearly out now, and Sarah banked the coals, saving them for morning. She lay down beside the kids, pulling her shawl tight, her body aching from the day's walk. John would take the first watch, sitting with his rifle across his knees, listening for anything that didn't belong. Sarah closed her eyes, the smell of beans and smoke still in the air, and tried to sleep. But her mind wouldn't rest. The flour was too low, the beans too few, and the creek too uncertain. What would they eat if the water wasn't there? What would they do if the trading post were a lie? The stars above offered no answers, and the night stretched on, quiet and heavy, waiting for dawn. Dawn crept over the plains, a soft gray light that softened the edges of the wagons. Sarah stirred first, her body stiff from the hard ground, her shawl damp with dew. The camp was quiet, the other families still wrapped in blankets, their fires just embers. She knelt by the fire pit, brushing ash from the coals, and coaxed a small flame with a handful of twigs. The pot of beans was where she'd left it, the water now cloudy, the beans swollen but still firm. She set the pot over the fire, stirring gently, the wooden spoon scraping the bottom in a slow, familiar rhythm. The smell was faint, earthy, a promise of breakfast, though it wouldn't be much. John was already up, checking the oxen, his breath visible in the chilly air. The kids slept on, their faces pale under the dirt, and Sarah let them rest a little longer. Today was a big day. The creek was close, or so they hoped, and every step would bring them nearer to water, maybe food, maybe a moment to breathe. She mixed dough for biscuits, her hands moving automatically, the flour and cornmeal blending into a gritty paste. Mrs. Wilson's trick, wrapping the dough in a damp cloth, worked better than she'd expected, and the biscuits came out less like rocks, though still heavy in her hands. She baked them on the skillet, the fire's heat warming her fingers, and set them aside to cool. The beans were ready now, soft enough to eat, and she scooped a small portion into each tin cup, saving the rest for later. The bacon rind stayed in its cloth, untouched, a last resort for a hungrier day. Breakfast was simple, a biscuit, a spoonful of beans, and water from the barrel, cloudy but safe. John came back from the oxen, his boots dusty, and took a share, eating standing up, his eyes on the trail ahead. Ellie woke next, helping Sarah clean the skillet, while Sam and Ben grumbled but sat up, their hands reaching for the warm biscuits. The wagon train came to life slowly, the creak of wheels and low voices filling the air. The Thompsons' baby was crying again, and Sarah saw Mary rocking her gently, her face tired but patient. Mr. Wilson walked by, tipping his hat, and offered a small bundle of dried sage, saying it might flavor the beans. Sarah thanked him, giving him a biscuit in return, the exchange a quiet ritual that tied the families together. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Carter, walked the line, checking each wagon, his voice calm but firm. He said the creek was half a day's walk, maybe less if the ground stayed firm. The news lifted Sarah's spirits, though she kept her hopes small, knowing the trail could lie. A creek meant a chance to refill the barrels, to soak more beans, maybe to find fish or greens. But it also meant a crossing, and she'd seen wagons lost to rivers before, their barrels floating away like dreams. The wagons rolled out, the oxen plodding steady, the dust rising in soft clouds. John walked beside the team, his hand on the lead ox's yoke, guiding it around a patch of rocks. Sarah kept pace, her skirt brushing the grass, her eyes scanning the ground for anything useful, a plant, a bone, a forgotten scrap from another train. Ellie stayed close, pointing out a cluster of yellow flowers, maybe edible, maybe not. Sarah shook her head, unsure, and Ellie nodded, used to the caution. Sam and Ben trailed behind, their steps slow, their boots wearing thin. The kids were quieter these days, their chatter replaced by long silences, their hunger a weight they carried without words. Sarah thought about the dried apples again, wondering if today was the day to open the tin, to see their faces light up at the sweet, chewy fruit. Not yet, she decided, not until the creek. The trail was kinder today, the ground flat, the air cooler under a sky streaked with clouds. Sarah's mind was on food, as always, planning the next meal, the next day, the next week. The beans would last another day, maybe two, if she portioned them carefully. The flour was the worry, the sack too light, the weevils a constant battle. She started mixing in more cornmeal, but even that was running low. The trading post, if it existed, was their hope, but hope was a fragile thing. She remembered a story from another family about a post that turned out to be a single shack with nothing to trade but whiskey and lies. John didn't talk about it, but she saw the worry in his shoulders, the way he checked the barrels every night, counting what was left. At midday, the wagon stopped, the oxen grazing on sparse grass. Sarah lit a small fire, warming the leftover beans, and handed out biscuits from the morning. The kids ate slowly, savoring each bite, their fingers catching every crumb. John sat with Carter, the wagon master, talking in low voices about the creek, the crossing, the miles ahead. Sarah listened, catching words like shallow and muddy, but nothing certain. Mary Thompson joined her, the baby asleep in her arms, and they talked about small things, how to keep flour dry, how to make coffee last. Mary said she'd found a patch of wild mint yesterday, and Sarah's eyes brightened. Mint could make water taste better, could soothe the stomach, could feel like a luxury. They agreed to look for more at the creek, if the creek was there. The afternoon wore on, the wagons creaking forward, the sun sinking low. The air grew heavy, a hint of moisture that made Sarah's heart lift. Water was near, maybe. Ellie ran ahead, her shawl flapping, and called back that she saw green, a line of trees, a shimmer of light. John quickened his pace, his hand shielding his eyes, and nodded. The creek was real, or seemed to be, its banks hidden by a rise in the land. The wagon train buzzed with quiet excitement, voices murmuring, kids pointing. Sarah felt a knot in her chest loosen, but not all the way. A creek could be a blessing or a trap. What if the water was bad? What if the crossing took their wagon? What if there was nothing to eat on the other side? The trail stretched ahead, and the answers were waiting just out of sight as the wagons rolled closer to the water's edge. The wagons slowed as the creek came into view, a thin ribbon of water glinting under the late afternoon sun. It wasn't wide, maybe 10 feet across, but it was there, its banks lined with scraggly willows and patches of green grass. Sarah's heart lifted at the sight, though her hands stayed busy, tying down the flour sack to keep it safe during the crossing. The wagon train stopped shore of the water, the oxen snorting, their hooves stirring the dust. John walked to the bank, his boots sinking slightly in the soft earth, and knelt to test the water with his hand. It was clear, cold, a good sign. He looked back at Sarah and nodded, his face still guarded, knowing a creek could give as much trouble as it solved. The kids ran closer, Ellie dipping her fingers in the water, Sam splashing Ben until Sarah called them back. The camp buzzed with quiet activity, families filling barrels, washing clothes, or just standing by the water, grateful for its promise. Sarah set up their fire near the creek, the ground softer here, easier to dig a pit. She filled a pot with fresh water, letting it boil to clean it, the steam rising in lazy curls. The beans from last night were gone, eaten at breakfast, so she started a new batch, pouring a handful from the sack into the pot. The beans rattled like small stones, and she counted them silently, knowing they wouldn't last the week. She thought about the bacon rind again, its salty promise, but decided to wait, hoping the creek might offer something else. Ellie came back with a handful of wild mint, her face bright, and Sarah smiled, crushing the leaves into the boiling water for a faint, fresh smell. It wasn't food, but it was something, a small comfort in a world of dust and hunger. She baked biscuits, using the damp cloth trick, their edges crisp but softer inside, and set them on a clean rock to cool. The wagon train settled into its evening rhythm, The wagon circled, the fires glowing against the dusk. John and Carter walked the creek's edge, talking about the crossing, their voices low. The water was shallow, Carter said, but the bottom was muddy and a wagon could get stuck. Sarah listened, stirring the beans, her mind on the barrels, the flour, the fragile weight of their supplies. If they lost a sack in the crossing, it could mean days without bread. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the fire, the pot, the kids' faces as they sat nearby, watching the flames. Mary Thompson stopped by, her baby asleep in a sling, and offered a small piece of cornbread, baked that morning. Sarah gave her a biscuit in return, and they sat for a moment talking about the mint, about how to stretch beans with wild greens. Mary said she'd seen fish in the creek, small ones, darting in the shallows. Sarah's eyes lit up, and she glanced at John, hoping he'd try his luck tomorrow. Supper was the same, a biscuit, a scoop of beans, a sip of mint-flavored water. The kids ate slowly, their spoons scraping the tin cups, their eyes on the creek as if it might offer more. John ate standing, his rifle nearby, his mind already on the crossing. Sarah took a small bite, saving most of her share for Ben, who looked thinner today, his cheeks hollow under the dirt. The meal was quiet, the camp sounds, soft voices, a horse's whinny, the creek's murmur, wrapping around them like a blanket. Sarah thought about the trading post, still days away, and what they might find. Flour was her prayer, but beans, bacon, or even a sack of dried fruit would do. She remembered the dried apples in the tin, their sweet tang a distant memory. Maybe tomorrow, she told herself, if the crossing went well. The kids helped clean up, Ellie rinsing the cups in the creek, Sam stacking the skillet by the fire. Ben stayed close, his stick drawing circles in the dirt, his voice soft as he asked if they'd eat fish tomorrow. Sarah said maybe, her hand ruffling his hair, though she wasn't sure. John came back from his talk with Carter, his face tired but calm. The crossing would start at dawn, he said, the wagons going one by one to keep the mud from churning. Sarah nodded, her hands folding the cloth she'd used for the biscuits, her mind on the ropes, the barrels, the weight of the wagon. She'd tie everything down tonight, double-checking the knots, making sure the flour stayed dry. The creek was a gift, but it was also a test, and the trail didn't forgive mistakes. The camp grew still, the fires burning low, the stars sharp above. Sarah sat by the fire, the beans simmering for tomorrow, the mint scent fading in the air. John took the first watch, his shadow long against the wagon, his rifle across his knees. The Thompsons' fire was out, their wagon dark, but Sarah heard Mary's soft humming, a lullaby for the baby. Mr. Wilson walked by, his pipe glowing, and nodded at Sarah, a quiet greeting. These small moments, these shared glances, were what kept the wagon train moving, a thread of trust in a land that offered none. Sarah thought about the fish, about the greens Ellie might find, about the trading post and its promises. But the creek loomed largest, its water a mirror for her hopes and fears. She lay down beside the kids, her shawl pulled tight, the ground cold but softer by the creek. The water's sound was steady, a gentle lap against the banks, and she tried to let it soothe her. But her mind wouldn't rest. The crossing was tomorrow, and the mud could take a wheel, a barrel, a sack of flour. The fish might not be there, the greens might be bitter, the trading post a rumor. The beans were too few, the biscuits too hard, and the kids' faces too thin. She closed her eyes, the fire's glow faint through her lids, and pictured the creek at dawn, its water catching the light. Would it carry them forward or pull them under? The night offered no answers, and the camp slept, waiting for the morning, as the creek whispered its secrets in the dark. The first light of dawn touched the creek, turning its surface to a soft silver. Sarah was already awake, her breath visible in the chilly air, her hands busy checking the wagon's ropes. The flour sack was tied tight, the bean bag wedged between barrels, the precious tin of dried apples tucked deep where water couldn't reach. She worked quietly, her fingers stiff but sure, knowing a loose knot could mean losing what little they had. The camp stirred around her, the wagon train a hum of low voices and creaking wood. John was with the oxen, rubbing their flanks, checking their hooves for stones. The kids were up, Ellie folding blankets, Sam and Ben stacking firewood they'd gathered from the creek banks. The beans from last night were ready, their smell faint but comforting, and Sarah stirred the pot, her spoon scraping the bottom in a steady rhythm. Breakfast would be quick: beans, a biscuit, a sip of creek water boiled with mint, because the crossing was coming, and every minute counted. The wagon master, Carter, walked the line, his hat pulled low, his voice calm as he called the order. The Thompsons would go first, their wagon light, their oxen strong. The Harpers were third, behind the Wilsons, whose wagon was heavy with tools but steady. Sarah listened, her heart thumping, though she kept her face still. The creek was shallow, Carter said, but the mud was thick, and a wheel could sink if they weren't careful. John came back, his hands dusty, and helped Sarah pack the cooking gear, the skillet wrapped in cloth, the pot tied to the wagon's side. The kids ate their beans sitting on the ground, their spoons slow, their eyes on the creek. Sarah gave Ben an extra spoonful, his thin frame worrying her, and took none for herself, sipping water to quiet her stomach. John ate fast, his biscuit gone in 3 bites, his mind on the oxen, the mud, the weight of the wagon. The crossing began as the sun climbed, the Thompsons' wagon rolling forward, its wheels cutting into the soft bank. The water was low, barely reaching the axles, but the mud sucked at the wheels, and their oxen strained, heads low, hooves slipping. Mary stood on the bank, her baby in her arms, watching as her husband guided the team. The wagon lurched, then steadied, and reached the other side, mud caked on its wheels. The camp let out a quiet breath, and the Wilsons went next, their wagon heavier, the oxen slower. Sarah watched, her hands twisting her apron, picturing their own wagon, their flour, their beans. The Wilsons made it, but one wheel sank deep, and Mr. Wilson had to dig it out, his coat streaked with mud. John nodded, taking it in, and turned to Sarah, saying they'd go slow, keep the oxen steady. She nodded back, her throat tight, and checked the ropes again, her fingers brushing the flour sack like a prayer. Their turn came, and John led the oxen to the bank, his voice low, urging them forward. The wagon creaked, its wheels sinking into the mud, the canvas flapping as it tilted. Sarah walked beside, her boots slipping, her hand on the wagon's side, ready to push if needed. The kids stayed on the bank, Ellie holding Ben's hand, Sam watching with wide eyes. The water was cold, swirling around Sarah's ankles, and the mud pulled at the wheels, each turn a struggle. John kept the oxen moving, their heads low, their breath steaming in the morning air. The wagon groaned, a barrel shifting slightly, and Sarah's heart jumped, but the ropes held. Halfway across, the left wheel sank deeper, and the wagon stopped, the oxen straining against the yoke. John cursed under his breath, a rare sound, and waded into the water, digging at the mud with a stick. Sarah joined him, her skirt heavy with water, her hands clawing at the slick earth. The camp watched, silent, and Carter came over, tossing a rope to pull if needed. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the wheel came free, and the wagon lurched forward, reaching the far bank with a jolt. Sarah climbed out, her hands shaking, and checked the barrels. The flour was dry, the beans safe, the apples still hidden. She let out a breath, her knees weak, and looked at John, his face streaked with mud, his eyes meeting hers. The kids ran across, splashing through the shallows, and Ellie hugged Sarah, her shawl damp. The wagon train moved on, each family crossing, some faster, some slower, but all making it by midday. Sarah lit a fire on the far bank, her hands still trembling, and warmed the leftover beans, their smell mixing with the creek's damp air. The biscuits were hard now, cold from the morning, but the kids ate them anyway, sitting on a blanket, their boots caked with mud. John drank creek water, his tin cup dented but full, and said the oxen needed rest. Sarah nodded, her mind on the next meal, the next mile, the trading post that felt too far away. The camp rested, the wagons scattered along the bank, the fires small but steady. Mary Thompson came by, her baby fussing, and said they'd lost a sack of cornmeal in the crossing, the mud claiming it. Sarah's stomach twisted, but she offered a handful of beans, knowing they couldn't spare it, but couldn't say no. Mary gave her a strip of dried fish, caught that morning, its scales glinting in the sun. Sarah thanked her, planning to boil it into a broth, maybe with the mint Ellie had found. The kids were by the creek, Ellie teaching Ben to skip stones, Sam looking for more mint or anything green. Sarah watched them, her heart heavy, knowing hunger was closer than she wanted to admit. The flour was too low, the beans a few days' worth, and the bacon rind wouldn't last. The trading post was their hope, but the trail was long, and the land didn't care. Evening settled over the camp, the creek a soft murmur, the fires glowing against the dusk. Sarah stirred the pot, the fish broth thin but fragrant, the mint giving it a faint sweetness. The kids ate slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces lit by the flames. John sat with Carter, talking about the trail ahead, a rocky stretch that would slow them down. Sarah listened, her hands folding the biscuit cloth, her mind on the barrels, the crossing, the days to come. The fish was a gift, but it was gone now, and the beans wouldn't stretch far. What would they eat when the sacks were empty? What would they find in a land of rock and dust? The creek had carried them across, but the trail was waiting, its promises as thin as the broth in her pot. The night by the creek was quiet, the water's gentle ripple blending with the soft crackle of dying fires. Sarah lay awake, her shawl pulled tight, listening to the kids' steady breaths and John's soft steps as he paced during his watch. The broth they'd eaten, flavored with Mary Thompson's fish and Ellie's mint, was a small comfort, but it sat light in her stomach, barely enough to quiet the hunger. She thought about their life before the trail, back in Illinois, where fields of corn stretched golden under the sun, and her mother's kitchen smelled of bread and stew. They'd been farmers, her and John, working land that wasn't theirs, scraping by on what they could grow and sell. The promise of Oregon, free land, rich soil, a new start, had pulled them west, but now, with the flour sack half empty and the trail stretching endless, that promise felt like a whisper in the wind. She closed her eyes, picturing the trading post, its shelves maybe stacked with beans or bacon, but the image blurred, replaced by the creek's muddy banks and the heavy weight of tomorrow. Morning came slow, the sky pale and streaked with clouds. Sarah rose before the kids, her hands cold as she relit the fire, the coals still warm under the ash. The pot of beans was nearly empty, just enough for a thin breakfast, and she mixed dough for biscuits, her fingers stiff in the chilly air. The creek's water was a blessing, clear and cold, and she filled their barrel, boiling extra for drinking. John was checking the wagon, tightening the ropes, his face set as he counted their supplies in his head. The crossing had shaken him, the wheels' near loss a reminder of how fragile their journey was. Ellie woke first, her hair tangled, and helped Sarah bake the biscuits, wrapping them in the damp cloth to keep them soft. Sam and Ben stirred, rubbing their eyes, and sat by the fire, their tin cups ready for the last of the beans. The meal was quiet, the camp still waking, the air heavy with the promise of moving on. The wagon train was a mix of folks, each with their own reasons for leaving home. The Thompsons, young and hopeful, had left a failing shop in Missouri, dreaming of a store in Oregon. Mary's cornbread, now lost to the creek, was a recipe from her mother, a small tie to the life they'd left. The Wilsons, older and childless, had sold their farm after a bad harvest, their wagon packed with tools and little else. Mr. Wilson's pipe smoke drifted through the camp, a familiar scent, and his wife's herbs were a gift to everyone. Then there was Carter, the wagon master, a man who'd crossed the plains twice before, his face lined like the trail itself. He knew the land, knew the creeks and passes, but even he couldn't promise food or safety. Sarah watched them all, their faces familiar now, their stories woven into hers. But food tied them closer than anything, each family counting their sacks, their barrels, their days. Sarah thought about the kids as she cleaned the skillet, her hands scraping at the grease. Ellie was 10, old enough to remember their farm, the way the table groaned with potatoes and pork on good days. She'd learned fast on the trail, spotting greens, tying knots, keeping Sam and Ben from wandering. Sam, 8, was quieter, his eyes always on the ground, searching for something to eat or play with. Ben, barely 6, was the worry, his small frame thinner every week, his questions about food sharper. Sarah had caught him yesterday, licking crumbs from his pocket, and her heart had twisted. She thought about the dried apples again, their sweet promise hidden in the tin. Not today, she decided, not with the trading post still days away. But the thought lingered, a small light in the long shadow of hunger. The wagons rolled out, the creek behind them, its banks churned to mud by the crossing. John guided the oxen, his steps steady, his eyes on the rocky trail ahead. Sarah walked beside, her skirt catching on thorns, her mind on the flour sack, the weevil she'd sifted out last night. The land was changing, the plains giving way to low hills, the grass thinner, the air drier. Carter said the trading post was 5 days off, maybe 6 if the rock slowed them. 5 days meant 5 meals, maybe 10, each one smaller than the last. Sarah calculated as she walked, her boots scuffing the dirt, her hands gripping the wagon's side. The beans would run out first, then the flour, unless they found game or greens. John's rifle was slung over his shoulder, but the plains were empty, the rabbits too quick, the deer long gone. The camp stopped at midday, the sun high, the air warm. Sarah lit a fire, small and quick, and warmed the leftover biscuits, their edges hard but edible. She boiled creek water, adding a pinch of mint, and gave the kids a sip each, their faces brightening at the taste. John ate standing, his eyes on the hills, his hand resting on the wagon. The Thompsons joined them, Mary's baby fussing, and they shared a story about a fish they'd caught, its scales silver in the creek. Sarah listened, her spoon stirring the empty pot, and thought about fishing tomorrow if they found another stream. The Wilsons sat nearby, Mrs. Wilson crumbling sage into a cup of water, her hands slow and careful. She offered Sarah a pinch, and Sarah gave her a biscuit, the exchange a quiet promise to keep sharing, to keep surviving. The afternoon stretched on, the wagons creaking over rocks, the oxen slowing. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could make with what they had. The beans were gone, the pot empty, but she had a handful of cornmeal left from the Wilsons' trade. She'd mix it with flour, make a thin gruel, maybe add the bacon rind for flavor. The kids would eat it, their spoons slow, their eyes on the fire. But what about tomorrow? What about the next hill, the next dry stretch? The trading post was a hope, but hope was thin, like the broth she'd served last night. She looked at John, his face dusty, his shoulders tight, and knew he was counting too. The trail was a question, its answer hidden in the dust, and the hunger was closer now, a shadow that grew with every step. The hills grew sharper as the wagon train rolled on, their rocky slopes casting long shadows over the trail. Sarah walked beside the wagon, her boots scuffing the dry earth, her eyes on the oxen's slow steps. The air was cooler now, a faint breeze carrying the smell of dust and pine, but it did little to ease the weight in her chest. The cornmeal gruel she'd planned for supper was all they had, a thin meal that wouldn't fill the kids' bellies, let alone John's. She thought about their farm back in Illinois, the lean years when drought turned the corn to stubble and the landlord took half their harvest. They'd eaten potato soup for weeks then, thin and watery, but it was enough to keep them going. Here, on the trail, even that seemed a luxury, with the flour sack dwindling and the trading post still days away. She glanced at John, his hat low, his hands steady on the ox yoke, and wondered if he regretted leaving. He never said it, but she saw it in the way he counted the barrels, his fingers lingering on the ropes. The wagon train was a patchwork of stories, each family carrying their own reasons for facing the trail. Sarah remembered the night they joined, back in Missouri, when the camp was all hope and chatter. The Thompsons had talked of their shop, how the debts piled up until they had no choice but to sell. Mary's hands, soft from years of measuring cloth, were calloused now, her cornbread a memory lost to the creek. The Wilsons had their own tale, their farm failing after a flood, their savings spent on the wagon and oxen. Mrs. Wilson's herbs, dried and tucked in a tin, were her way of holding on, each pinch a reminder of her garden. Carter, the wagon master, was quieter about his past, but Sarah had heard he'd lost a family on an earlier crossing, his steady voice hiding a grief that kept him moving west. Food was their common thread, the one thing that bound their stories. Each meal a small act of defiance against the trail's hunger. Sarah's hands were busy as they stopped for the midday rest, the wagons forming a loose circle under a scraggly tree. She lit a fire, small and quick, and mixed the cornmeal with water, her spoon stirring in slow circles. The gruel was lumpy, barely enough for 5, but she added a pinch of Mrs. Wilson's sage, hoping the flavor would make it feel like more. The kids sat close, their faces dusty, their eyes on the pot. Ellie helped, holding the tin cups, while Sam and Ben poked at the fire, their sticks sending up sparks. John ate his share standing, his back to the wagon, his eyes scanning the hills for game that wasn't there. The meal was silent, the gruel gone too fast, the cups scraped clean. Sarah sipped creek water, its mint taste faint now, and saved her portion for Ben, slipping it into his cup when he wasn't looking. He needed it more, his small hands thinner every day. The camp was quieter today, the crossing strain lingering in tired faces and short words. Sarah saw Mary Thompson by her wagon, mending a torn skirt, her baby asleep in a crate. They traded a glance, a nod, but no words. Words took energy, and energy was for walking, cooking, surviving. Mr. Wilson passed by, his pipe unlit, and offered a small bundle of dried roots, saying they'd boil into something edible. Sarah thanked him, giving him a biscuit from the morning, though it was hard as stone. These exchanges were the camp's heartbeat, but there was a shadow now, a whisper of worry. Last night, Sarah had heard Carter talking to the Wilsons, his voice low, about a family at the back of the train, the Millers who'd been hoarding flour. No one said it loud, but the thought hung heavy. What if someone took more than their share? What if the camp broke under the weight of hunger? The wagons moved on, the trail rougher now, the rocks jarring the wheels. Sarah walked beside, her hand on the wagon, her mind on supper. The gruel was gone, the beans finished, and the flour wouldn't last 3 days. She'd boil the roots from Mr. Wilson, maybe add the bacon rind for flavor, though it was more fat than meat. The kids were quieter, their steps dragging, their chatter replaced by long looks at the empty plains. Ellie had stopped pointing out flowers, Sam's pebbles stayed in his pocket, and Ben's questions about food were softer, as if he knew the answer. Sarah thought about their farm again, the nights when John would come in from the fields, his hands rough, his smile warm. They'd had little, but they'd had enough. Now, enough was a dream, and the trading post was their only hope, a speck on a map that might not exist. Evening came, the sky turning purple, the hills dark against the horizon. The wagons circled, the fires lit, the camp settling into its routine. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling the roots in creek water, their earthy smell mixing with the smoke. The bacon rind went in, its grease swirling, a faint promise of flavor. The kids sat close, their blankets pulled tight, their faces lit by the flames. John checked the oxen, his steps slow, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The camp was tense, the miller's wagon quiet at the edge, their fire small. Sarah heard a murmur from the Thompsons, something about flour, but she didn't ask. She stirred the pot, her spoon steady, her mind on the kids, on John, on the trail. The roots were tough, the broth thin, but it was food, and food was life. The meal was small, a cup of broth each, the roots chewy but warm. Sarah gave Ben her share, saying she'd eaten earlier, though her stomach ached. John ate slowly, his eyes on the fire, his thoughts somewhere else. The kids sipped their broth, their spoons scraping, their faces tired but grateful. Sarah cleaned the pot, her hands moving in the same rhythm as always, her mind on tomorrow. The flour was nearly gone, the roots a one-night gift, and the trading post was too far. What would they eat when the pot was empty? What would hold the camp together if trust broke? The hills loomed silent, the stars cold above, and the trail stretched on, its secrets buried in the dust. The night was cold, the stars sharp above the hills, and Sarah lay under her shawl, the fire's faint glow warming her face. The broth from the roots and bacon rind was gone. The kids' cups scraped clean, and the empty pot sat by the fire, a quiet reminder of how little they had left. She thought about their last winter in Illinois, when snow piled high and the pantry held only potatoes and a jar of pickled beets. They'd made it through, her and John, taking turns telling stories to keep the kids' minds off hunger. Now, on the trail, stories weren't enough, and the trading post was a hope that felt thinner with every mile. She listened to John's steps as he took watch, his shadow moving against the wagon, and wondered if he blamed her for agreeing to this journey. The hills were silent, the camp asleep, but the question of what they'd eat tomorrow lingered like dust in the air. Morning broke slow, the sky gray and heavy, a hint of rain in the distance. Sarah rose, her hands stiff as she relit the fire, the coals barely alive under last night's ash. The flour sack was dangerously low, enough for a few more biscuits, and the cornmeal was nearly gone. She mixed what she could, her fingers kneading the dough, her mind counting the days to the trading post. For maybe 5, Carter had said, but the hills were slowing them, and the oxen were tired. John was with the animals, brushing their hides, his face set as he checked their ribs, too sharp under the skin. Ellie helped Sarah, her small hands shaping biscuits, while Sam and Ben gathered twigs, their steps slow, their eyes on the ground for anything edible. Breakfast was a single biscuit each, small and hard, with a sip of creek water boiled the night before. Sarah skipped her share, sipping water to quiet her stomach, her eyes on Ben, whose cough was sharper today. The wagon train was a fragile thing, its families bound by necessity, but fraying under hunger. Sarah thought about the Millers, their wagon at the camp's edge, their fire always small, their faces turned away. She'd seen Mrs. Miller yesterday, her hands quick to hide a sack when Sarah passed. The whisper of hoarding was louder now, a shadow over the camp. The Thompsons had lost their cornmeal, and the Wilsons shared what little they had, but the Millers kept to themselves, their silence louder than words. Sarah remembered a neighbor back in Illinois, a man who'd hidden grain during a lean year, his barn full while others went hungry. It had broken the town, trust turning to dust. She didn't want that here, but the flour sack in her own wagon was too light, and the kids' faces too thin. She looked at John, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and wondered if he'd heard the whispers too. The wagons rolled out, the trail winding through hills, the rocks jarring the wheels. Sarah walked beside, her skirt catching on brush, her hands steadying the barrels. The oxen plodded, their heads low, and John guided them, his voice soft but firm. The kids trailed behind, Ellie pointing out a patch of green, maybe sorrel, maybe nothing. Sarah shook her head, too tired to hope, and Ellie nodded, her face quiet. The trail was harder now, the hills steep, the ground uneven. Carter rode ahead, his horse kicking up dust, checking for a path that wouldn't break a wheel. He'd told stories last night, his voice low by the fire, about a train he'd led 2 years back, when hunger turned friends to strangers. Sarah hadn't listened long, but the words stuck, a warning of what hunger could do. Midday brought a brief stop, the wagon scattered under a low ridge. Sarah lit a fire, small and smoky, and boiled the last of the cornmeal into a thin mush, adding a pinch of sage for flavor. The kids ate slowly, their spoons scraping, their eyes on the hills. John took his share standing, his hand on the wagon, his gaze distant. Mary Thompson came by, her baby in her arms, and offered a handful of dried berries, their color faded but sweet. Sarah gave her a biscuit, the exchange a quiet promise, though her hands shook as she handed it over. The berries were a treasure, and she saved them for the kids, planning to mix them with tomorrow's mush. She thought about the Millers again, their wagon apart, their fire barely lit. Carter had spoken to them, his voice sharp, but nothing changed. The camp felt smaller, its trust thinning like the flour in Sarah's sack. The afternoon was long, the wagons creaking over rocks, the air heavy with the threat of rain. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could make with almost nothing. The flour would make a few more biscuits, but the cornmeal was gone, and the roots were a memory. She'd boil the bacon rind tonight. Let's grease flavor a thin broth, maybe add a leaf or two from Ellie's finds. The kids were quieter, their steps dragging, their hunger a weight they carried in silence. Sarah remembered their farm, The way John would carry Ben on his shoulders, Ellie running through the fields, Sam chasing fireflies. They'd been thin then too, but not like this, not with hunger a constant shadow. The trading post was their hope, but the hills were high, and the trail was slow. Evenings settled over the camp. The wagons circled, the fires flickering. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with the bacon rind. Its smell faint but rich. She added a handful of greens Ellie had found, their leaves tough but edible, and stirred the pot, her spoon moving in slow circles. The kids sat close, their blankets tight, their faces pale in the firelight. John checked the wagon, his hands on the ropes, his eyes on the hills. The camp was tense, the miller's wagon dark, their silence louder than ever. Sarah heard a murmur from the Thompsons, a whisper about flour, about trust. She stirred the broth, her heart heavy, her mind on the kids, on John, on the trail. The bacon rind was gone, the flour nearly spent, and the trading post was too far. What would they eat when the pot was empty? What would hold the camp together when hunger broke them? The hills stood silent, the stars cold, and the trail stretched on, its secrets deeper than the night. The fire's glow was faint, the broth long gone, and Sarah sat by the embers, her hands folded in her lap, the empty pot a shadow at her feet. The kids slept under their blanket, their breaths soft but shallow, their faces thinner in the flickering light. John was on watch, his silhouette dark against the hills, his rifle a quiet weight across his knees. The camp was still, but the silence felt heavy, like the air before a storm. The miller's wagon stood apart, its canvas dark, no fire to warm it. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Miller's hands, quick to hide that sack, or the whispers from the Thompsons about flour hoarded while others went hungry. Back in Illinois, she'd seen hunger turn neighbors to strangers, and the thought of it here, with the trading post days away and the flour sack nearly empty, made her chest tight. She thought about the kids, about Ben's cough, about the dried apple she hadn't touched. What would they eat tomorrow? What would hold the camp together if trust broke like a brittle twig? Morning came gray, the hills wrapped in mist, the air damp with the threat of rain. Sarah knelt by the fire, her fingers cold as she coaxed a flame from last night's coals. The flour was down to a handful, enough for a few small biscuits, and she mixed it with water, her hands slow, her mind on the miles ahead. John was with the oxen, his voice low as he checked their harnesses, his face drawn. He hadn't slept, she could tell, his eyes fixed on the trail, on the trading post that felt more like a story than a place. Ellie woke, her shawl tight around her shoulders, and helped Sarah shape the biscuits, her small fingers careful, as if the dough was gold. Sam and Ben stirred, their eyes heavy, their hands reaching for the fire's warmth. Breakfast was a biscuit each, no bigger than child's fist, with a sip of water from the barrel. Sarah gave Ben half her share, his cough sharper now, and sipped the rest herself, the water tasteless without mint. The wagon train was unraveling, the hunger pulling at its seams. Sarah saw it in the Thompsons' faces, Mary's eyes red from sleepless nights, her baby quieter than a baby should be. The Wilsons kept their fire small, their herbs running low, Mrs. Wilson's hands shaking as she poured water. Carter walked the camp, his boots heavy, his voice steady but strained. He'd called the Millers to talk last night. Sarah had heard, but they'd stayed silent, their wagon a wall against the camp. The rumor was they had flour, maybe beans hidden under blankets, enough to last weeks while others scraped by. Sarah remembered a winter in Illinois when a neighbor's barn burned, some set on purpose, after he'd refused to share. She didn't want to believe the Millers would do that, but hunger changed people, and the camp's trust was as thin as the biscuits in her hand. The wagons rolled out, the trail steep, the rocks jarring the wheels. John guided the oxen, his steps slow, his hand tight on the yoke. Sarah walked beside, her skirt damp from the mist, her eyes on the kids trailing behind. Ellie was quiet, her gaze on the hills, searching for greens that weren't there. Sam kicked stones, his boots worn thin, while Ben lagged, his cough a soft rasp in the air. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could make with nothing. The flour was gone after breakfast, the cornmeal spent, the bacon rind boiled dry. She'd saved a few leaves from Ellie's foraging, tough and bitter, and planned to boil them into a broth, maybe with a pinch of sage from the Wilsons. It wouldn't fill them, but it would warm them, and warmth was something in a world of cold hills and empty sacks. At midday, the wagon stopped in a hollow, the mist thicker, the air heavy. Sarah lit a fire, small and smoky, and boiled the greens, their smell sharp but better than nothing. The kids sat close, their blankets around their shoulders, their eyes on the pot. John ate standing, his biscuit from breakfast saved in his pocket, crumbled now, but still food. Mary Thompson came by, her baby asleep, and offered a single dried berry, her hand trembling as she held it out. Sarah gave her a sip of the broth, the exchange a quiet plea to hold on. Mary whispered about the Millers, saying she'd seen Mr. Miller with a full sack, his eyes darting when she passed. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking, but said nothing. She thought about Carter, about his stories of a train that broke apart, families turning on each other over a sack of beans. Was that their future here in these hills? The afternoon was slow, the wagons creaking up a steep rise, the oxen straining. Sarah's mind was on the kids, on Ben's cough, on the trading post that seemed farther with every step. She thought about their farm, the way John would sing to Ellie when the nights were long, his voice rough but warm. They'd had lean times, but never like this, never with hunger a shadow that followed them. The camp was quieter, the families keeping to their wagons, their fires small. The Millers stayed at the back, their oxen slow, their canvas tight. Sarah saw Carter ride past them, his face hard, his hand on his knife. No one spoke of it, but the air was thick, the trust that had carried them through the creek, now cracking under the weight of empty bellies. Evening came, the mist turning to a light rain, the hills dark against a fading sky. Sarah knelt by the fire, the broth ready, its thin steam rising in the damp air. She served it in tin cups, the greens soft but tasteless, the sage barely a hint. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces pale. John sat with them, his rifle nearby, his eyes on the Miller's wagon, dark at the camp's edge. The camp was silent, the Thompsons' fire out, the Wilsons' low. Sarah heard a cough from Ben, sharp and dry, and her heart twisted. The broth was gone, the flour spent, and the trading post was too far. What would they eat when the cups were empty? What would break first, the camp or their hope? The rain fell soft, the fire hissed, and the hills kept their secrets, waiting for the dawn. The rain fell steady now, a soft patter on the wagon's canvas, the fire hissing under its touch. Sarah sat by the embers, her shawl damp, her hands clutching the empty pot, its metal cold against her fingers. The kids were asleep, their blankets heavy with moisture, Ben's cough a faint rasp in the dark. John stood watch, his shadow blending with the misty hills, his rifle a silent weight. The camp was quiet, but the silence carried a sharpness, like a blade hidden in the fog. The Miller's wagon was a dark shape, no fire, no sound, their secrecy a weight on the camp. Sarah thought of the whispers, of flour hidden while her own sack was empty, and her stomach twisted. Back in Illinois, she'd seen a family shunned for less, their name a curse in the town. Here, with the trading post days away and hunger closer than the rain, trust was a thread fraying fast. She closed her eyes, picturing the dried apples in their tin, but the thought of opening it felt like giving up. What would they eat when the dawn came? What would break first, the camp or their hearts? Morning broke wet, the hills slick, the sky a heavy gray. Sarah rose, her bones aching from the damp ground, and relit the fire, her hands trembling as she struck flint against steel. The flour was gone, the last biscuits eaten, and the only food left was a handful of greens Ellie had found, too bitter to eat raw. She boiled them in the pot, the water cloudy, the fire weak under the rain. John was with the oxen, his coat soaked, checking their hooves for cuts from the rocky trail. Ellie woke, her hair damp, and helped Sarah stir the pot, her face quiet, her eyes on Ben, who coughed as he sat up. Sam was silent, his hands in his pockets, no pebbles to kick today. Breakfast was a thin broth, barely a sip each, the greens chewy and sharp. Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough louder now, and sipped water to quiet her hunger. John ate standing, his eyes on the trail, his jaw tight. The trading post was 4 days off, maybe, but the hills were steep, and the rain wasn't helping. The wagon train was a shadow of itself, the families moving like ghosts in the mist. Mary Thompson's baby was quiet, too quiet, and Sarah saw the worry in Mary's eyes as she rocked her. The Wilsons kept their wagon close, their fire small. Mrs. Wilson's herbs gone, her hands empty. Carter rode through the camp, his horse slipping on the wet rocks, his voice low as he called for the wagons to move. The Millers were at the back, their wagons slow, their canvas tight. Sarah had heard Carter's voice last night, sharp and low, talking to Mr. Miller by their fireless wagon. No one knew what was said, but the camp felt it, a crack in the trust that had held them through the creek. Sarah remembered a story from her mother about a town that turned on itself when food ran low, neighbors stealing from neighbors. She didn't want to believe it of the Millers, but the empty pot in her hands said otherwise, and Ben's cough was a clock ticking down. The wagons rolled out, the trail muddy, the wheels slipping on wet stones. John guided the oxen, his boots sinking, his voice steady but tired. Sarah walked beside, her skirt heavy with rain, her hands gripping the wagon to keep it from sliding. The kids trailed behind, Ellie holding Ben's hand, Sam staring at the ground. The hills were cruel, their slopes slowing the oxen, the rocks threatening to break a wheel. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could scrape together. The greens were gone, the flour spent, and the bacon rind a memory. She thought about the dried apples, their sweet promise, but opening the tin felt like admitting defeat. Maybe she'd boil bark from the trees, like she'd heard some families did, or chew grass to fill their bellies. The trading post was their hope, but hope was a thin thing in the rain, and the hills didn't care. Midday brought a brief stop. The wagons huddled under a rocky overhang, the rain a steady drum. Sarah lit a fire, small and sputtering, and boiled water, adding a few leaves Ellie had found, their taste bitter but better than nothing. The kids sipped the broth, their spoons slow, their faces pale. John stood by the wagon, his coat dripping, his eyes on the trail ahead. Mary Thompson came by, her baby wrapped tight, and offered a small fish bone, saved from the creek. Sarah gave her a sip of the broth, the exchange a quiet bond in the damp air. Mary whispered about the Millers, saying she'd seen Mrs. Miller with a sack, maybe flour, maybe beans hidden under a blanket. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy, but said nothing. She thought about Carter, about the train he'd lost, about the hunger that turned men to shadows. Was that their fate, here in these hills? The afternoon was slow, the wagons creaking through mud, the oxen slipping. Sarah's mind was on Ben, on his cough, on the way his eyes followed the pot. She thought about their farm, the way John would carve wooden toys for the kids, his hands steady despite the lean years. They'd had nothing then, but they'd had each other, and the land had given enough. Now, the land gave nothing, and hunger was a guest that never left. The camp was tense, the families keeping to their wagons, their fires small. The Millers stayed at the back, their silence a wall, their wagon a mystery. Sarah saw Carter watching them, his hand on his knife, his face hard. No one spoke of it, but the air was thick, the trust that had carried them through the creek, now a thread stretched to breaking. Evening settled, the rain lighter, the hills dark against a gray sky. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with a handful of bark, its smell sharp and woody. The kids sat close, their blankets damp, Ben's cough a steady rhythm. John checked the wagon, his hands on the ropes, his eyes on the Miller's dark shape. The camp was silent, the Thompsons fire out, the Wilsons low. Sarah served the bark broth, a sip each, its taste bitter but warm. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces tired. Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough a knife in her heart. The trading post was too far, the hunger too close, and the Millers' secret loomed like the hills. What would they eat when the fire died? What would break first, the camp or their wool? The rain fell soft, the night closed in, and the trail waited, its answers hidden in the dark. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the hills dark and slick under a sky that refused to clear. Sarah sat by the dying fire, her shawl heavy with damp, her hands gripping the empty pot, its metal cold and slick. The kids were asleep, their blankets sodden, Ben's cough a sharp echo in the quiet night. John paced the camp's edge, his boots silent in the mud, his rifle a shadow across his back. The miller's wagon stood alone, its canvas tight, no light, no warmth. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Miller's quick hands, hiding that sack, or the whispers from Mary Thompson about flour hoarded while others starved. Back in Illinois, Sarah had seen a family cast out for stealing a neighbor's grain. Their name whispered like a curse. Here, with the trading post still days away and the kids' faces thinner every morning, the camp's trust was crumbling like the biscuits she could no longer make. She thought of the dried apples, their tin hidden deep in a wagon, but opening it felt like surrender. What would they eat when the dawn broke? What would hold the camp together when hunger turned them to strangers? Morning came heavy, the air thick with mist, the hills looming like silent watchers. Sarah rose, her joints stiff from the wet ground, and coaxed a flame from the fire's ashes, her hands trembling in the cold. The pot was empty, the greens gone, the flour spent. She had a few blades of grass Ellie had gathered, tough and bitter, and she boiled them in water, the steam faint and scentless. John was with the oxen, his coat soaked, his hands checking their harnesses, their ribs sharper under his touch. Ellie woke, her eyes tired, and helped Sarah stir the pot, her fingers slow, her face pale. Sam and Ben stirred, Ben's cough louder, a dry rasp that cut through the drizzle. Breakfast was a sip of grass broth, barely enough to wet their lips, and Sarah gave Ben her share, his small hands shaking as he held the cup. John ate nothing, his eyes on the trail, his jaw tight. The trading post was 3 days off, maybe 4, and the hills were unforgiving. The wagon train was a ghost of itself, the families moving like shadows in the mist. Mary Thompson's baby was silent now, her cries replaced by a stillness that worried Sarah. Mary's face was drawn, her hands clutching a torn shawl, her eyes on her wagon's empty barrels. The Wilsons kept close, their fire barely lit, Mrs. Wilson's hands empty of herbs, her voice quiet. Carter rode through the camp, his horse slipping on the muddy trail, his voice hoarse as he urged the wagons forward. The Millers stayed at the back, their wagon slow, their silence louder than the rain. Sarah had seen Carter stop by their wagon last night, his hand on his knife, his words sharp but unheard. The camp felt it, though, a crack in the bond that had carried them through the creek. Sarah remembered her mother's stories of a town torn apart by hunger, neighbors turning on each other over a loaf of bread. She didn't want to believe it of the Millers, but Ben's cough was a clock, and the empty pot was a truth she couldn't ignore. The wagons rolled out, the trail muddy, the wheels sinking into the soft earth. John guided the oxen, his boots slipping, his voice low but steady. Sarah walked beside, her skirt heavy, her hands gripping the wagon's side to keep it from sliding. Ellie stayed close, her eyes on the ground, searching for anything edible, a root, a leaf, a berry. Sam trailed behind, his hands in his pockets, his boots worn through. Ben lagged, his cough a steady rhythm, his steps slow. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could scrape together. The grass was gone, the broth a memory, and the dried apples were all they had. She thought about boiling them, their sweetness a gift for the kids, but the tin was her last hope, and the trading post was too far. She remembered a neighbor in Illinois who'd boiled leather to feed his kids, the taste bitter but filling. Would it come to that here in these hills? Midday brought a stop under a rocky outcrop, the drizzle steady, the air cold. Sarah lit a fire, small and weak, and boiled water, adding a few twigs she'd found, their bark peeling in her hands. The kids sipped the hot water, their cups trembling, their faces pale. John stood by the wagon, his coat dripping, his eyes on the hills. Mary Thompson came by, her baby wrapped tight, and offered a single dried fish scale, saved from the creek. Sarah gave her a sip of the water, the exchange a quiet thread in the camp's fraying fabric. Mary whispered about the Millers, saying she'd heard Mr. Miller argue with Carter, his voice low but angry. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking, but said nothing. She thought about Carter's stories, about the train that broke apart, about hunger that turned men to wolves. Was that their path, here in the rain? The afternoon was slow, the wagon slipping through mud, the oxen straining. Sarah's mind was on Ben, on his cough, on the way his eyes followed her hands. She thought about their farm, the way John would carry Sam through the fields, his laugh warm despite the lean years. They'd had little, but they'd had hope. Now, hope was the trading post, a name on a map, a promise that might be a lie. The camp was tense, the families keeping to their wagons, their fires small. The millers stayed at the back, their wagon a shadow, their secrecy a weight. Sarah saw Carter watching them, his face hard, his hand on his knife. No one spoke of it, but the air was thick, the trust that had held them, now a whisper in the rain. Evening came, the drizzle fading, the hills dark against a gray sky. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with a handful of bark, its smell sharp and bitter. The kids sat close, their blankets damp, Ben's cough a steady beat. John checked the wagon, his hands on the ropes, his eyes on the miller's dark shape. The camp was silent, the Thompsons fire out, the Wilsons low. Sarah served the bark water, a sip each, its taste harsh but warm. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces tired. Sarah gave Ben her share, his coffin knife in her chest. The trading post was too far, the hunger too close, and the miller's secret loomed like the hills. What would they eat when the fire died? What would break first, the camp or their hope? The night closed in, the stars hidden, and the trail waited, its secret. The night was heavy, the drizzle gone, but the air still thick with damp, the hills looming like silent judges. Sarah sat by the fire's faint glow, her shawl clinging to her shoulders, her hands empty, the pot cold and barren beside her. The kids slept fitfully, Ben's cough a sharp stab in the quiet, his small body curled tight under a damp blanket. John stood watch, his boots rooted in the mud, his rifle a dark line against the misty hills. The miller's wagon was a shadow at the camp's edge, its canvas taut, its silence louder than the wind. Sarah's mind churned with the whispers of flour hoarded, of sacks hidden while her own were empty, while Ben's cough grew worse, and the trading post felt like a dream. Back in Illinois, she'd seen hunger break a family, a father stealing from his own kin to feed his kids. Here, with the trail stretching endless and the camp's trust fraying like a worn rope, she feared worse. The dried apples sat untouched in their tin, a last hope she couldn't bring herself to open. What would they eat when the morning came? What would snap first, the camp's fragile bond, or their will to keep going? Dawn broke cold, the sky a dull gray, the hills slick with mud. Sarah rose, her body aching, and scraped together a fire, her hands numb as she struck flint against steel. The pot was empty, the grass broth gone, and all they had was a handful of roots Ellie had dug yesterday, their dirt still clinging to them. She boiled them in water, the steam weak, the smell earthy but thin. John was with the oxen, his face gaunt, his hands checking their harnesses, their ribs sharp under dusty hides. Ellie woke, her eyes hollow, and helped Sarah stir the pot, her fingers trembling. Sam and Ben stirred, Ben's cough a dry rasp, his face pale as the mist. Breakfast was a sip of root broth, barely enough to warm their hands, and Sarah gave Ben her share, his coffin knife in her heart. John took nothing, his eyes on the trail, his silence heavier than the rain. The trading post was 3 days away, Carter said, but the hills were steep, the oxen weak, and the mud clung like a curse. The wagon train was unraveling, its families bound by fear, but pulling apart under hunger. Mary Thompson's baby hadn't cried in days, a stillness that made Sarah's stomach twist. Mary's hands shook as she tied her wagon's ropes, her eyes avoiding the miller's dark shape. The Wilsons were quiet, their fire barely lit, Mrs. Wilson's hands empty, her face lined with worry. Carter moved through the camp, his horse stumbling, his voice cracking as he called for the wagons to roll. The millers stayed at the back, their wagons slow, their canvas hiding secrets. Last night, Sarah had seen Carter stop by their wagon, his hand on his knife, his voice low and sharp. Mr. Miller's reply was a murmur, but the camp felt the weight of it, a fracture in the trust that had held them through the creek. Sarah remembered a winter in Illinois when a neighbor's barn burned, the town whispering of revenge over stolen grain. She didn't want to believe it of the Millers, but Ben's cough was a clock, and the empty pot was a truth she couldn't escape. The wagons lurched forward, the trail muddy, the wheels sinking deep. John guided the oxen, his boots slipping, his voice hoarse as he urged them on. Sarah walked beside, her skirt sodden, her hands gripping the wagon to keep it steady. Ellie stayed close, her eyes on the ground, searching for roots or leaves, finding nothing but stones. Sam trailed behind, his hands empty, his boots worn through. Ben lagged, his cough louder, his steps faltering. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could find in a land of mud and rock. The roots were gone, the broth of memory, and the dried apples were all they had. She thought about boiling them, their sweetness a gift for Ben, but the tin was her last card, and the trading post was too far. She remembered stories of pioneers eating their shoes, the leather boiled soft, and wondered if it would come to that here in these hills. Midday brought a stop in a rocky hollow, the mist thick, the air cold. Sarah lit a fire, small and sputtering, and boiled water, adding a few blades of grass Sam had found, their taste bitter but warm. The kids sipped it, their cups trembling, their faces gaunt. John stood by the wagon, his coat heavy with mud, his eyes on the hills. Mary Thompson came by, her baby limp in her arms, and offered a single fishbone, its edges sharp. Sarah gave her a sip of the water. They exchanged a desperate thread in the camp's breaking web. Mary whispered about the Millers, saying she'd seen Mrs. Miller with a sack, her hands quick to hide it. Sarah nodded, her throat tight, but said nothing. She thought about Carter's stories, about a train that turned on itself, about hunger that made men monsters. Was that their future here in the mist? The afternoon was slow, the wagons slipping through mud, the oxen straining. Sarah's mind was on Ben, on his cough, on the way his eyes clung to her. She thought about their farm, the way John would hold Ellie when the nights were cold, his voice soft with stories. They'd had nothing then, but they'd had each other. Now, hunger was their shadow, and the camp was cracking. The Millers stayed at the back, their wagon a mystery, their silence a blade. Sarah saw Carter ride past them, his face hard, his hand on his knife. Last night, she'd heard voices raised, Carter sharp, Mr. Miller's low, the words lost but the anger clear. The camp was tense, the families avoiding each other, their fire small. Sarah's hands shook as she walked, her mind on the tin of apples, on Ben's cough, on the trading post that might not exist. Evening came, the mist thicker, the hills dark against a fading sky. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with a handful of bark, its smell sharp and bitter. The kids sat close, their blankets heavy, Ben's cough a relentless beat. John checked the wagon, his hands on the ropes, his eyes on the Miller's dark shape. The camp was silent, the Thompsons' fire out, the Wilsons barely lit. Sarah served the bark water, a sip each, its taste harsh but warm. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces pale. Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough of fire in her chest. The trading post was too far, the hunger too close, and the Miller's secret was a storm waiting to break. What would they eat when the fire died? What would shatter first, the camp or their hope? The mist closed in, the night heavy, and the trail held its breath, its secrets poised on the edge of dawn. The mist hung heavy, a cold veil over the hills. The night, so still it seemed the world held its breath. Sarah crouched by the fire's dying embers, her shawl sodden, her hands clutching the empty pot, its weight a mirror of her fear. The kids slept uneasily, Ben's cough a relentless stab in the dark, his small frame shaking under a damp blanket. John stood watch, his boots rooted in the mud, his rifle a silent sentinel against the hill's looming shadows. The Miller's wagon was a ghost at the camp's edge, its canvas dark, its silence a scream in the quiet. Sarah's mind churned with Mary Thompson's whispers, a flower hidden while Ben's cough grew sharper, while the trading post remained a flicker in the distance. Back in Illinois, she'd seen a man beaten for stealing a neighbor's bread, his family driven from town. Here, with hunger gnawing like a wolf and the camp's trust broken, she feared a darker reckoning. The tin of dried apples sat untouched, a final spark she couldn't yet light. What would they eat when dawn broke? What would shatter first, the camp or their souls? Morning came raw, the mist thicker, the hills slick and unforgiving. Sarah rose, her body heavy with cold, and scraped a fire from last night's ashes, her hands numb as she struck flint. The pot was barren, the bark water gone, and all they had was a single root Ellie had found, its dirt caked thick. She boiled it in water, the steam faint, the smell muddy and weak. John was with the oxen, his face hollow, his hands brushing their ribs, too sharp under their hides. Ellie woke, her eyes sunken, and stirred the pot, her fingers slow, her face pale as the fog. Sam and Ben stirred, Ben's cough a dry hack, his eyes feverish in the dim light. Breakfast was a sip of root water, barely enough to wet their tongues, and Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough a blade in her chest. John took nothing, his gaze fixed on the trail, his silence a wall. The trading post was 2 days away, Carter said, but the hills were cruel, the oxen faltering, and the mist clung like despair. The wagon train was a skeleton, its families moving like wraiths in the fog. Mary Thompson's baby was a ghost, its silence louder than cries, and Mary's hands trembled as she tied her wagon's ropes, her eyes empty. The Wilsons were shadows, their fire dead, Mrs. Wilson's hands clutching a torn shawl, her voice gone. Carter rode through the camp, his horse stumbling, his voice a rasp as he urged the wagons on. The Millers stayed at the back, their wagon a fortress, their silence a poison. Last night, Sarah had heard voices, Carter's sharp, Mr. Miller's low, a third voice, maybe Mrs. Miller's, rising in anger. The camp felt it, a fracture widening, the trust that had crossed the creek now dust. Sarah remembered her father's stories of a town torn by hunger, a family's house burned for hoarding grain. She didn't want to believe it of the Millers, but Ben's cough was a death knell, and the empty pot was a truth she couldn't bury. The wagons lurched forward, the trail a quagmire, the wheels sinking deep. John guided the oxen, his boots slipping, his voice cracking as he urged them through the mud. Sarah walked beside, her skirt heavy, her hands gripping the wagon, her heart pounding as it tilted on a rock. Ellie stayed close, her eyes on the ground, searching for roots, finding only stones. Sam trailed, his hands empty, his boots splitting at the seams. Ben lagged, his cough a relentless drum, his steps barely lifting from the mud. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could find in a land of rock and mist. The root was gone, the water a memory, and the dried apples were all they had. She thought about opening the tin, their sweetness a prayer for Ben, but it was her last hope, and the trading post was a shadow. She remembered tales of pioneers chewing their belts, the leather boiled to nothing, and wondered if that was their fate, here in these hills. Midday brought a stop in a barren hollow, the mist choking, the air raw. Sarah lit a fire, small and weak, and boiled water, adding a few twigs Sam had found, their bark bitter but warm. The kids sipped it, their cups shaking, their faces gaunt. John stood by the wagon, his coat sodden, his eyes on the hills, his hand on his rifle. Mary Thompson came by, her baby limp, and offered single fish scale, its edges dull. Sarah gave her a sip of the water, the exchange a desperate thread in the camp's collapse. Mary whispered about the Millers, saying she'd seen Mr. Miller with a knife, his eyes hard when Carter approached. Sarah nodded, her throat tight, her mind on Carter's stories of a train that devoured itself. Hunger, turning men to beasts. Was it their end, here in the fog? The afternoon was endless, the wagons slipping through mud, the oxen collapsing under the strain. Sarah's mind was on Ben, on his cough, on the fever in his eyes. She thought about their farm, the way John would sing to Sam when the nights were lean, his voice a warmth they'd lost. Hunger was their master now, and the camp was breaking. The Millers stayed at the back, their wagon a specter, their secret ablaze. Sarah saw Carter ride past them, his face a mask, his hand on his knife. Last night's voices echoed in her mind. Carter's demand, Mr. Miller's defiance, a woman's cry cut short. The camp was silent, the families avoiding each other, their fires dead. Sarah's hands shook as she walked, her mind on the tin of apples, on Ben's cough, on the trading post that might be a lie. She heard a shout from the back, Carter's voice, sharp and raw, and the camp froze, eyes turning to the Miller's wagon. Evening came, the mist a shroud, the hills black against the dying sky. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with a handful of grass, its smell sharp and empty. The kids sat close, their blankets heavy, Ben's cough a death march. John stood by the wagon, his rifle ready, his eyes on the Miller's dark shape. The camp was a tomb, the Thompsons' fire gone, the Wilsons a flicker. Sarah served the grass water, a sip each, its taste harsh but warm. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces hollow. Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough a fire in her soul. The trading post was too far, the hunger too close, and the Miller's secret was a spark in dry grass. What would they eat when the fire died? What would break first, the camp or their lives? The shout echoed again, closer now, and the night held its breath, poised on the edge of chaos. The shout from the Miller's wagon hung in the air, sharp and raw, like a crack in the misty night. Sarah froze, her hands on the pot of grass water, its bitter steam fading in the cold. The kids stirred, Ben's cough a harsh gasp, his feverish eyes glinting in the firelight. John stepped closer, his rifle tight in his hands, his boots sinking into the mud as he faced the dark shape of the Miller's wagon. The camp was a graveyard, the Thompsons' fire gone, the Wilsons a faint glow. Every eye turned toward the shout. Sarah's heart pounded, her mind racing with whispers of hidden flour, of hunger that had turned the camp to strangers. Back in Illinois, she'd seen a fight over a stolen pig, blood on the snow, families torn apart. Here, in the Old West, with the trading post of fading hope and Ben's cough a ticking clock, the stakes were higher, the hunger sharper. The tin of dried apples weighed heavy in her thoughts, a secret she guarded like a prayer. What would they eat when the fire died? What would break first, the camp or their lives? The shout came again, louder, and then a woman's cry. Mrs. Miller's voice, high and desperate, cut through the fog. The camp held its breath, the mist thick, the hills silent witnesses. Sarah stood, her shawl slipping, her hands trembling as she set the pot down. John glanced at her, his face hard, and moved toward the Miller's wagon, where Carter's voice rose, sharp and commanding. The kids huddled closer, Ellie's arm around Ben, Sam's eyes wide. Sarah wanted to follow John, to know what was happening, but Ben's cough kept her rooted, his small body shaking. She thought of the Millers, their wagon a fortress, their silence a poison. The whispers had grown louder, flour, beans, maybe bacon, hidden while others starved. But the cry was new, a twist that turned her stomach. Was it fear? Anger? Something worse? She remembered a story from her father about a pioneer train where hunger led to betrayal, a man left behind for stealing. Here, with the wagon train on the edge, the truth was closer and more dangerous. The fire hissed, the mist swirled, and the voices grew louder, a storm brewing in the dark. Carter's voice cut through, demanding, "Open the wagon, Miller, or I'll do it myself." Sarah's breath caught, her eyes on John's shadow, his rifle ready. The camp was awake now, figures moving in the fog, the Thompsons' wagon creaking as Mary peered out, her baby silent. The Wilsons stood by their fire, Mr. Wilson's pipe unlit, his hands clenched. Mrs. Miller's voice came again, softer, pleading, "We ain't got nothing, I swear." But the words rang hollow, and Sarah saw Mary Thompson shake her head, her face tight with hunger and doubt. The Millers had been quiet too long, their wagon too heavy, their fire too small. Sarah's mind flashed to Ben, to his fever, to the empty pot. The trading post was 2 days away, maybe 3, but the oxen were weak and the trail was mud. The dried apples were her last hope, but even they wouldn't save Ben if his cough worsened. What was hidden in the miller's wagon? What would it cost to find out? The voices stopped, a sudden silence that was worse than the shouts. Sarah's heart raced, her hands twisting her apron. John was close to the miller's wagon now, Carter beside him, their shadows merging in the mist. A rustle came, canvas flapping, and then a thud, heavy and dull like a sack hitting the ground. The camp gasped, a collective breath, and Sarah's mind spun. Was it flour? Beans? Or something else? Something they hadn't dared imagine? She remembered a neighbor in Illinois, caught hiding meat while others starved, his family driven out in shame. Here, in the Old West, survival was a blade, and hunger cut deep. Ben coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his forehead, hot as the fire should have been. Ellie whispered, "What's happening, Ma?" And Sarah shook her head, her throat too tight for words. The miller's secret was unraveling, but at what price? The silence broke with Carter's voice, low and dangerous. "You lied to us, Miller. All this time." Sarah stood, her shawl falling, her eyes straining through the mist. John was there, his rifle raised, his face a mask of anger and fear. A figure moved, Mr. Miller, his hands up, his voice stammering, "It's for my kids, same as you." But the camp didn't listen. Mary Thompson stepped forward, her voice sharp. "My baby's starving, and you've got sacks?" The Wilsons murmured, their shadows closing in, the camp a tightening circle around the miller's wagon. Sarah's stomach twisted, her mind on Ben, on the pot, on the trading post that might never come. The twist wasn't just the sacks. It was the lie, the betrayal, the crack that could shatter the wagon train. She thought of the pioneers who'd crossed before, their stories of survival, of hunger that turned men to shadows. Here, the shadow was real, and it was growing. The mist thickened, the fire sputtered, and Sarah's hands shook as she held Ben close, his cough a drum in her chest. John's voice came, low and steady. "Carter, what's in the sack?" The answer hung, a moment stretched thin, and Sarah's breath stopped. Footsteps crunched, a rustle of canvas, and then a gasp. Mrs. Wilson's, maybe, or Mary's. Sarah couldn't see, the mist a wall, but the camp's silence was a scream. Was it food? Was it enough to save Ben, to save them all? Or was it something darker, something that would break the camp beyond repair? She thought of the dried apples, her last secret, and wondered if she'd have to use them tonight, if Ben's fever broke or if the camp did. The trading post was a whisper, the trail a trap, and the miller's wagon was the spark. Another shout, Carter's voice raw and final. "Everybody, step back." The camp tensed, the mist a shroud, and Sarah's heart pounded, her eyes on John, on Ben, on the wagon that held their fate. What was in the sack? What would it cost them all? The night closed tight, the hills silent, and the trail waited, its secrets ready to ignite. The mist swirled thick, a cold shroud over the camp, the fire's faint glow barely cutting through the dark. Sarah stood frozen, her hands clutching Ben, his cough a ragged gasp in her arms, his fever burning through his thin shirt. John was by the miller's wagon, his rifle raised, his shadow merging with Carter's in the fog. The camp was a held breath, the Thompsons' wagon silent, the Wilsons' fire a dying spark, every eye on the miller's dark canvas. Carter's voice, raw and final, echoed in Sarah's ears. "Everybody, step back." And the thud of the sack hitting the ground replayed in her mind. Was it flour? Beans? Enough to save Ben, to save them all? Or something else, something that would tear the wagon train apart? Back in Illinois, she'd seen a town turn on a man for hiding grain, his family driven into the snow. Here, in the Old West, with the trading post a distant prayer and hunger a wolf at their heels, the stakes were higher, the betrayal deeper. The dried apples in their tin were her last secret, but Ben's cough was a clock, and the miller's sack was a spark in dry grass. What was hidden in that wagon? What would it cost to know? The silence shattered with Mr. Miller's voice, low and desperate. "It ain't what you think, Carter, I swear." Sarah's heart pounded, her eyes straining through the mist, Ben's weight heavy in her arms. Ellie clung to Sam, their faces pale, their blankets damp. Carter stepped closer, his knife glinting, his voice a growl. "Open it, Miller, or I will." The camp tightened, shadows moving. Mary Thompson, her shawl tight, her baby silent. Mr. Wilson, his hands clenched, his pipe forgotten. Mrs. Miller sobbed, a choked sound. "Please, we was only scared." But the camp didn't hear, the hunger too loud, the trust too broken. Sarah thought of the pioneers who'd crossed before, their stories of survival, of hunger that turned friends to foes. The sack was the truth, but the truth could be a blade. She held Ben closer, his cough of fire in her chest, and prayed for flour, for beans, for anything to keep him alive. The trading post was 2 days off, maybe, but the oxen were failing, and the trail was mud. Carter's hand moved, slicing the sack's tie, and the camp gasped as the contents spilled into the mud. Sarah squinted, her breath caught, expecting grain or beans, but the glint was raw metal, not food. Cans, rusted and dented, rolled out, their labels faded, their promise uncertain. The camp froze, the hope of flour crumbling like dust. Mary Thompson's voice cracked. "Cans? While my baby starves." Mr. Wilson stepped forward, his face hard. "What's in it, Miller? You hid this for what?" Mr. Miller stammered. "It's just preserves, peaches, some corn. We traded for him back in Missouri, for our kids." But the camp's anger was a tide, the hunger too deep. Sarah's stomach twisted, her mind on Ben, on the empty pot, on the dried apple she hadn't touched. Preserves could save them, but cans were heavy, and the Miller's lie was heavier. Why hide them? Why let the camp starve while they carried weight that slowed the oxen? The twist came sharp, Carter's voice cutting through, not at the Millers, but at the camp. "Enough!" he roared, his knife raised, his face a mask of exhaustion. "We're tearing ourselves apart, and for what? Cans that might be spoiled, that won't feed us all." Sarah's breath stopped, her eyes on Carter, his horse shifting nervously behind him. He'd led them through the creek, through the hills, but now his voice shook, his hand trembling. "I lost a train once," he said, quieter, "because we turned on each other. I won't lose this one." The camp fell silent. The mist a wall, and Sarah saw the crack in Carter's strength, a man who'd buried his failures in the trail's dust. The Miller's cans were a spark, but Carter's doubt was a new shadow, a twist that raised the stakes. If their leader faltered, what held the wagon train together? Ben coughed, a wet, choking sound, and Sarah's heart broke, her mind on the trading post, on the cans, on the camp's rage. John lowered his rifle, his eyes on Carter, his voice low. "What now, then? We can't eat trust." The camp murmured, Mary Thompson stepping closer, her voice sharp. "They lied, Carter. They let us starve." Mrs. Miller knelt by the cans, her hands shaking. "We was in a share, I swear, when we got to the post." But the words were thin, and the camp's hunger was thicker. Sarah thought of her farm, the lean winters when John would share their last potato with a neighbor, his hands steady despite the cold. Here, sharing was survival, and the Miller's secret was a betrayal. She looked at Ben, his fever bright in his eyes, and wondered if the cans held enough to save him. The trading post was a hope, but hope was fading, and the camp was a powder keg, Carter's words the only thing keeping it from igniting. The mist closed in, the fire sputtered, and Sarah's hand shook as she held Ben, his cough a death knell. John stepped closer to Carter, his rifle at his side, his face torn between anger and fear. The camp was a circle now, the Millers at its center, their cans a pile of broken promises. Mary Thompson's voice rose. "We need those cans, Carter, now." Mr. Wilson nodded, his hands tight. "They owe us." Carter's knife lowered, his eyes on the Millers, then on the camp, his voice a whisper. "We vote, then. Share the cans, or leave the Millers behind." Sarah's breath caught, her mind spinning. Leave them? In the Old West, alone was death, but hunger was death, too. Ben's cough echoed, and she thought of the dried apples, her last card, her last hope. The camp's voices rose, a murmur turning to a roar, and Carter's hand shook, his leadership a thread stretched to breaking. The cans were food, maybe, but the vote was a blade, and the trading post was too far. What would the camp choose? What would it cost? The mist thickened, the night a trap, and the trail held its secrets, ready to explode. The mist was a cold shroud, the camp a powder keg, the miller's wagon a spark ready to ignite. Sarah held Ben tight, his cough a wet rasp, his fever scorching her hands as the camp's voices roared around the pile of dented cans. Carter stood at the center, his knife lowered, his face etched with exhaustion, his voice trembling as he called for a vote. Share the miller's preserves or leave them behind in the Old West's merciless hills. John was beside him, his rifle at his side, his eyes torn between anger and hope. Mary Thompson's voice cut through, sharp with hunger. They lied to us, Carter. My baby needs those cans. Mr. Wilson nodded, his hands clenched. They owe the wagon train. Mrs. Miller knelt by the cans, sobbing. We was scared, same as you. But the camp's rage was a tide, the hunger too deep, the trust shattered like a broken wheel. Sarah's mind raced, her heart on Ben, on the empty pot, on the dried apple she hadn't touched. The trading post was 2 days away. Maybe, but Ben's cough was a death knell, and the camp was breaking. What would the vote bring? What would it cost? The voices grew louder, a storm of desperation, as Carter raised his hand, his voice cracking, one by one, say your piece. The Thompsons went first, Mary's voice shaking, share the cans. We all starve else. The Wilsons followed, Mrs. Wilson's eyes wet. They hid food while we gave our last herbs. But we need it, so share. Sarah's turn came, her throat tight, Ben's cough echoing in her ears. She looked at John, his face hard, then at the Millers, their kids' shadows small behind the canvas. Share, she whispered, her voice breaking. For the kids, all our kids. The camp murmured, the vote tipping toward mercy, but the Millers' lie hung heavy, and not all agreed. A man from the back, a loner named Hayes, spat. Leave him. They chose themselves over us. The camp tensed, the mist a wall, and Carter's hand shook, his leadership a thread stretched thin. Sarah held Ben closer, his fever afire, and prayed the cans weren't spoiled, that they'd save him, that the wagon train wouldn't break. Carter counted the votes, his voice low, the camp silent, but for Ben's cough and the rustle of mist. Share, he said finally, his shoulders sagging. We open the cans, divide him equal. The camp exhaled, some with relief, some with anger. Mr. Miller stepped back, his face pale, as Carter knelt by the cans, his knife prying one open. The smell hit first, sweet, sharp, the tang of peaches preserved in syrup. Sarah's mouth watered, her hunger a beast, and the camp leaned closer, hope flickering like the fire. Carter dipped a finger, tasted it, and nodded. It's good. The camp murmured, Mary Thompson's eyes wet, Mrs. Wilson's hands trembling. Carter opened more corn, beans, a dozen cans in all, enough for a few days if they stretched it. Sarah's heart lifted, her mind on Ben, on a spoonful of syrup to ease his cough. The Miller's secret was food, not enough to reach the trading post, but enough to keep them alive. The camp's trust was scarred, but the vote had held them together, a fragile thread in the Old West's hunger. The cans were divided, each family taking a share, the camp working in silence, the mist a heavy curtain. Sarah took their portion, 2 cans, 1 peaches, 1 corn, and tucked them in the wagon, her hands steady despite the hunger clawing her stomach. She boiled water, adding a spoonful of corn, the smell rich and warm, a promise of life. The kids sipped it, Ben's cough softer with the syrup's sweetness, his fever still high, but his eyes brighter. John sat close, his rifle down, his face softening as he watched Ben sip. The camp ate quietly, the Thompsons' baby stirring, Mary's voice a soft hum. The Wilsons shared their fire, Mr. Wilson's pipe lit for the first time in days. The Millers stayed at their wagon, their kids eating, their faces down. The hunger was eased, the trust patched, and the trading post felt closer, a hope they could reach. Sarah thought of their farm, of lean winter survived, and felt a spark of that strength. The wagon train was battered, but it was whole, and survival was theirs for now. But the twist came soft, like a shadow in the mist, as Carter stood by his horse, his face pale, his voice low. I lied, he whispered to John, To Sarah, to no one, his eyes on the hills. The trading post ain't 2 days. It's 4, maybe 5, and the trail's worse ahead. Sarah's breath stopped, her hands on the pot, the corn's warmth fading. The camp didn't hear, their spoons scraping, their hope fragile as glass. Carter's secret was a blade, sharper than the miller's lie, a truth he'd hidden to keep them moving. The cans would run out, Ben's cough would linger, and the trail was a trap. Sarah looked at John, his face hard again, his hand on his rifle. The dried apples were still in their tin, her last card, but 4 days was a lifetime in the Old West. The camp was together, the hunger eased, the miller's betrayal faced, but Carter's lie was a new weight, a twist that turned hope to dust. Ben coughed, softer now, and Sarah stirred the pot, her mind on the trail, on the post, on survival. The camp settled, the fires low, the mist a blanket over the hills. Sarah sat by Ben, his fever warm, his breath steady for now. John took watch, his eyes on Carter, on the millers on the trail. The cans were a gift, the vote of victory, but the trading post was farther, the trail harder, and Carter's lie a shadow they couldn't shake. Sarah thought of the pioneers who'd crossed before, their stories of survival, of hunger faced and overcome. The wagon train was alive, the kids fed, the trust mended, but the trail wasn't done with them. She touched the tin of apples, her fingers lingering, and wondered if they'd need them tomorrow, if Ben's cough would worsen, if the camp would hold. The mist cleared, the stars faint above, and the trail stretched on, its secrets deeper than the night, its end a question unanswered. The night was still, the mist thinning to reveal a scattering of stars, the hills dark and silent around the wagon train. Sarah sat by the fire's low glow, her shawl damp, her hands stirring the pot where a spoonful of preserved corn simmered, its faint sweetness a fragile comfort. Ben slept beside her, his cough softer but still present, his fever eased by the peach syrup she'd given him, though his face remained pale. John was on watch, his boots quiet in the mud, his rifle a steady weight, his eyes lingering on Carter's silhouette by his horse. The camp was quiet, the miller's cans divided, the vote to share a thin thread holding them together after the betrayal of hidden food. But Carter's lie, for 5 days to the trading post, not 2, hung heavier than the mist, a secret that could break the pioneers' fragile hope. Back in Illinois, Sarah had seen a neighbor lose faith after a promised harvest failed, his family scattered. Here, in the Old West, with the trails stretching longer and the cans too few, survival was a flicker and trust was a shadow. The dried apples remained in their tin, untouched, a last hope she clung to. What would they eat tomorrow? Would the wagon train hold? Or would Carter's lie be its undoing? Morning came cold, the sky a pale gray, the hills slick with last night's rain. Sarah rose, her body stiff, and relit the fire, her hands steady as she coaxed a flame from damp twigs. The pot held a small portion of corn, safe from last night, and she warmed it, the smell rich but fleeting. John was with the oxen, his face drawn, his hands brushing their ribs, their strength fading with each muddy mile. Ellie woke, her eyes tired, and helped Sarah serve the corn, her fingers careful, as if the food was glass. Sam and Ben stirred, Ben's cough a dry rasp, his eyes brighter but weak. Breakfast was a spoonful each, the corn sweet but gone too fast, and Sarah sipped water, giving Ben her share, his cough a constant worry. John ate standing, his gaze on Carter, who moved through the camp, his voice low, his shoulders hunched. The trading post was 4 days away, maybe 5, and the cans wouldn't last. The miller's wagon was quiet, their kids' faces down, the camp's forgiveness as thin as the broth Sarah had boiled days ago. The wagon train was a wounded thing, its families bound by necessity, but bruised by lies. Mary Thompson's baby stirred, a faint cry breaking the silence, and Mary's face softened, her hands clutching a can of beans. The Wilsons kept their wagon close, their fire small, Mrs. Wilson's hands empty of herbs, her eyes on the hills. Carter called for the wagons to move, his voice steady but hollow, his lie a weight he carried alone. The miller stayed at the back, their wagon slow, their shame a barrier. Sarah saw Mary glance at them, her lips tight, the memory of their hidden cans still raw. The vote had saved them, but trust was a fragile thing, and Carter's lie was a new crack. Sarah remembered a winter in Illinois when a preacher's promise of aid never came, the town turning bitter. Here, the pioneers' survival hung on the trading post, but 4 days was a lifetime, and the trail was a test they might not pass. The wagons rolled out, the trail muddy, the wheels slipping on rocks. John guided the oxen, his boots sinking, his voice soft but firm. Sarah walked beside, her skirt heavy, her hands steadying the wagon, her mind on the cans on Ben on the trading post. Ellie stayed close, her eyes on the ground, searching for roots or greens, finding only mud. Sam trailed, his hands empty, his boots worn thin. Ben lagged, his cough quieter but persistent, his steps slow. Sarah's mind was on supper, on what she could stretch from the cans. The peaches were half gone, the corn low, and the beans too few. She'd mix a spoonful of each, boil it with water, make a thin stew to warm them. The dried apples were a last card, but Ben's cough kept them locked away. She thought of stories of pioneers eating their harnesses, the leather boiled soft, and prayed it wouldn't come to that in these hills. Midday brought a stop in a rocky hollow, the air cold, the sky heavy. Sarah lit a fire, small and smoky, and warmed the last of the corn, adding a spoonful of beans, the smell faint but filling. The kids ate slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces pale but grateful. John stood by the wagon, his coat muddy, his eyes on Carter, who sat alone, his horse tethered, his face buried in his hands. Mary Thompson came by, her baby quiet, and offered a pinch of salt, her hand steady. Sarah gave her a sip of the stew, the exchange a quiet bond in the camp's tension. Mary whispered about Carter, saying she'd heard him talking to his horse, muttering about a pass ahead, a steep climb that could break the oxen. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking, her mind on the trail, on the cans, on Ben. The trading post was a hope, but Carter's lie made a ghost, and the pass was a new shadow. The afternoon was slow, the wagons creaking up a rocky slope, the oxen straining. Sarah's mind was on Ben, on his cough, on the fever that lingered. She thought of their farm, the way John would carry Ellie through the snow, his laugh a warmth they'd lost. The camp was quiet, the families keeping to their wagons, their fire small. The millers stayed at the back, their silence a weight, their cans a memory. Sarah saw Carter ride ahead, his horse slipping, his face hard. The pass was close, he'd said, a narrow path that would test them. The cans were running out, the oxen weakening, and Ben's cough was a clock. Sarah's hands shook as she walked, her mind on the dried apples, on the pass, on the trading post that might be a lie. She heard a cough from Ben, sharp and wet, and her heart stopped, her eyes on him, on John, on the trail. Evening came, the sky dark, the hills steep around them. Sarah knelt by the fire, boiling water with a spoonful of peaches, their syrup sweet but thin. The kids sat close, their blankets heavy, Ben's cough softer but heavy. John checked the wagon, his hands on the ropes, his eyes on Carter, who stood by the pass's edge, his figure small against the rocks. The camp was silent, the Thompsons fire low, the Wilsons out. Sarah served the peach water, a sip each, its warmth a fleeting gift. The kids sipped slowly, their spoons scraping, their faces tired. Sarah gave Ben her share, his cough a wound in her soul. The trading post was too far, the pass too steep, and Carter's lie was a chain. What would they eat when the cans ran dry? Would the pass break them, or would they break themselves? The fire flickered, the night cold, and the trail loomed, its secrets sharper than ever. The fire's faint glow flickered against the steep hills, the night cold and heavy as the wagon train camped at the pass's edge. Sarah sat by Ben, her shawl tight, her hand stirring a pot of peach syrup water, its sweet smell a thin comfort in the Old West harsh air. Ben's cough was softer, his fever down, but his small frame was frail, his eyes tired but hopeful. John stood nearby, his rifle down, his face softened as he watched the kids sip their share. The camp was quiet, The miller's can's nearly gone. The vote to share a fragile bond holding the pioneers together after their betrayal. Carter's lie, for 5 days to the trading post, not 2, was a shadow, the steep pass ahead a new test. Sarah thought of their farm in Illinois, the lean winters they'd survived, and clung to the dried apples in their tin, her last hope if the trail broke them. The wagon train was battered, but it was alive, and survival was a spark they kept burning. What would the past bring? Would the trading post be real, or another lie? Morning broke clear, the sky a pale blue, the pass's rocky path glinting in the sun. Sarah rose, her body aching, and lit a fire, her hand steady as she warmed the last spoonful of beans, their smell faint but warm. John was with the oxen, his hands gentle on their hides, their strength low but steady. Ellie helped Sarah serve the beans, her fingers careful, while Sam and Ben sat close. Ben's cough quiet, his face brighter. Breakfast was a small bite each, the beans gone too fast, and Sarah sipped water, giving Ben her share, his health her anchor. Carter moved through the camp, his voice firm but tired, urging the wagons to face the pass. The Millers were with the group now, their kids eating small shares, their faces down but present. Mary Thompson's baby cried, a soft sound that lifted the camp, and Mary smiled, her hand steady. The Wilsons shared their fire, Mrs. Wilson's hands offering a pinch of salt, a small gift. The trading post was 4 days off, Carter said, his lie confessed, his leadership bruised but holding. The pass was the test, and the pioneers were ready, their hunger a weight they carried together. The wagons climbed the pass, the trail narrow, the rocks sharp under the wheels. John guided the oxen, his boots slipping, his voice steady as he urged them up. Sarah walked beside, her skirt catching on stones, her hands gripping the wagon, her heart pounding as it tilted. Ellie stayed close, her eyes on Ben, who walked slowly, his cough faint but present. Sam carried twigs, his hands full, his boots worn but moving. The climb was slow, the oxen straining, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Carter rode ahead, his horse sure-footed, his face set as he scouted the path. The camp was quiet, the families focused, their trust patched by the shared cans. Sarah thought of the Millers, their shame a quiet weight, but their kids' small smiles a sign of healing. She remembered a neighbor in Illinois, forgiven after sharing his last grain, his family welcomed back. Here, in the Old West, survival meant mending, and the wagon train was learning step by step. Midday brought a stop on a flat ridge. The pass half climbed, the air thin and cold. Sarah lit a fire, small and quick, and boiled water, adding the last of the peaches, their syrup a faint sweetness. The kids sipped it, their spoons slow, their faces warm by the flames. John stood by the wagon, his eyes on the trail, his hand resting on Sarah's shoulder, a quiet strength. Mary came by, her baby stirring, and offered a dry berry, her face soft. Sarah gave her a sip of the peach water, the exchange a thread in the camp's new bond. Carter sat alone, his horse tethered, his hands tracing a map, his face heavy with the weight of his lie. He'd told John last night, his voice low, that the trading post was real, a small fort with supplies, but the trail was brutal, and he'd hidden the truth to keep them moving. Sarah's heart lifted, her mind on the post, on flour, on beans, on Ben's cough fading. The cans were gone, but the dried apples were hers, and the pass was theirs to conquer. The afternoon was grueling, the pass steeper, the oxen faltering. Sarah's mind was on supper, on the apples she'd finally opened, their sweetness a gift for the kids. The wagons reached the pass's peak as the sun sank, the trail flattening, the hills falling away to reveal a valley below, a faint smoke rising in the distance. Carter pointed, his voice steady. "That's it, the post." The camp murmured, hope flickering, the pioneers' eyes bright despite their hunger. Sarah's heart soared, her hands on Ben, his cough soft, his fever gone. The trading post was real, 3 days off now, the trail easier ahead. The camp camped on the peak, the air cold but clear, the stars sharp above. Sarah opened the tin, the apple's sweet smell filling the air, and gave each kid a piece, their faces lighting up. John ate his share, his smile warm, his hand on hers. The camp shared small fires, the Millers joining, their kids shy but welcomed. Mary's baby cried, a healthy sound, and the Wilsons laughed. There saw the gift in the stew Sarah boiled with the last corn. The wagon train rolled on, the valley's trail kinder, the trading post closer each day. Sarah walked with Ben, his cough gone, his steps stronger, the apples a memory that saved him. The camp was whole, the Millers forgiven, their cans a lesson in sharing. Carter led, his lie a scar but his map true, the post a fort with flour, beans, and bacon. They reached it on the third day, their barrels filled, their hunger eased, the pioneers' survival a story they'd carry to Oregon. Sarah thought of their farm, of lean winters, of John's songs, and knew they'd make it. The wagon trained their strength. The Old West had tested them, hunger their foe, but food, shared, rationed, hoped for, had bound them. The trail stretched on, but the stars were bright, and the pioneers' hearts were full, their story a whisper of survival, trust, and home.